reports, and Mr. Payne. Not sure how you want to proceed. You want to present your supplementary paper, or do you want to do something?
What would be most useful for the panel?
Your Dr. Creason's agree. No, beyond that, I think we can go through the topics, can't we?
Yep. And maybe just for each topic he summarises his overall position, and then we can ask questions about that.
Yeah. So just as preliminary matters, you describe yourself as a ecological practitioner.
Yes.
Is environmental practitioner. Are you a ecologist?
Yes.
So your qualifications are in ecology and zoology.
Yes, biological sciences.
Biological sciences, yeah. And so you're in the same area of expertise as Dr. Keesing and Dr. Bradley.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, in terms of the topics, there is ecological significance of the vegetation. There is the issue of natural inland wetlands. There is the issue of impact on lizards.
And other animals, like this lizards. I put more emphasis in this last supplementary information.
Right.
Because it seemed to be a focal point of the hearing earlier on. So I just wanted to provide further clarification.
And you don't claim to be an herpetologist?
I haven't undertaken formal training, so training at university as a herpetologist, but I've undertaken extensive surveys and salvages of lizards over the last 10 years. I've published papers on herpetology. I have presented at the New Zealand Ecological Society conference on independent research that I've undertaken on lizards, which was conducted over an entire year of surveying lizards. So my understanding and experience in lizards is very in-depth.
Okay. And then what are the other topics? Are there any other topics?
I go into the ecological effects and around the effects.
Right.
Further detail and clarification around.
Yeah. That's essentially around terrestrial ecology.
Around terrestrial ecology, yeah. The effects around wetland ecology I maintain are simply unknown because an assessment of that hasn't been undertaken to any great degree by either or the applicant, and that needs to be taken to the other what those effects are.
All right. And you agree with the watercourse identification of Dr. Keesing?
So I'll be honest, I actually overlooked that matter as part of my initial review of the Section 92. I took Dr. Keesing's word for it, that these were drains, and I looked at the 88 aerial and part of that. I've since been involved with other applications, and this matter was brought up as part of that, where I had determined an area to be a drain, and council in that case asked whether that drain was situated within a natural water body, and if so, that would constitute it as a river. And the rationale behind that is that there may have been a natural watercourse within that wetland there, if it were to occur. And so then what is seen by that drain is simply an augmented or highly modified river. So if the drains are situated within a natural water source, and there is there's a reasonable degree of uncertainty whether it would have, if there was a natural watercourse within that wetland, then my understanding is that that drain would be a river.
Right. Okay. So coming to the significance of the indigenous vegetation, did you just want to summarize for us whether this is properly characterized as an information deficit question, or whether it's an assessment question? In other words, you use the data that you've been provided and your assessment is different.
I haven't used data that's been provided to determine whether this is significant or not in its entirety. I've used parts of the data. I use the DBHs that are recorded to understand the age of the trees in these areas. But what I have relied on is my site visit within these areas and recording and understanding the structure, the way that these forests are comprised. So in determining representativeness, I've had to rely on my understanding and benchmark of what are these forests, how they put together, and other components of these forests present within these areas that are typical. And in doing so, what I've considered is the full structure in the tiers of a forest, and also unique kind of components that you would expect to be in these areas, and are they present or not? And so as part of that, I looked at, do we have forest seedlings coming through here? Do we have dense leaf litter as an area for native invertebrates? Do we have coarse woody debris of various sizes and rotting at different levels as habitat for invertebrates and potentially lizards in these areas? Are there saplings? Are there shrubs, divaricating shrubs in these areas? Are there tree ferns in these areas? Are there ground ferns in these areas? Is there climbing, various climbing epiphytes? Are there perched epiphytes? Are there ferns associated with those perched epiphytes? Are there filmy ferns? Are there native mosses? Are there orchids? Are there mature trees within these areas? And how are they all comprised together in that complexity there to say, is this representative forest or not? And as part of that, when I did my site walkover, I started at...
Can I just clarify, what did you exclude from Dr. Keating's part?
What did I exclude from it? I looked at his data, his plot data, and I agree with his plot data that where he sampled those plots, particularly in Forest B, because there wasn't a plot in Forest A, in Forest B.
Is Forest A the one closest to the scenic reserve?
Yes, yes. So in Forest B, I agree 100% with his plots that they show that those areas where he sampled there do not meet the representativeness criterion, because the middle tiers have been impacted and degraded to a point that they don't hold that ecological integrity and structure. So and that was my assessment walking through the forest. I totally agree with Dr. Keating.
So your difference lies in Forest A?
In Forest A and B, both of these forests. So that was when I walked through the edges, the margins of the forest. Once I made it to the middle of the forest and saw a distinct shift in the composition and the density and the diversity of these forests in those areas, my opinion changed. I walked into there and they were entirely consistent with what I would expect from a forest with ecological integrity and meeting the representativeness. So
I don't understand. If you accept the transect, which the data on Forest B, which has the plots.
Yes. I can can explain this further if you like.
Well,
But I'll be on this.
Can I just ask a question, John? Clear, because I'm getting a bit confused with Forest A and Forest B. So if I'm looking at your figure 4 from evidence,
Evidence.
so your main evidence and chain figure 4, it's about page 35 and 38.
you mean figure 5?
Oh, yeah,
Figure 4.
yes, so the yellow one is Forest A,
Yeah.
the blue one is Forest B.
Okay, so Forest A is the blue larger piece.
That's Forest B. The blue. Yellow one's Forest A.
Okay, what's where I'm getting confused because this figure, Forest A blue line, Forest B
Oh,
yellow line.
Yeah, I got that wrong, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so Forest A is the yellow.
Yes,
Okay, that's what I'm getting confused.
yeah, fair enough, yeah.
I've got to write that down before I get again.
Yeah. So the Dr. Keesing's transects
There's plots.
is plots.
Yeah.
Across a line, or is plots around the,
So his plots in Forest B,
yeah,
so there wasn't a plot done in Forest A.
yeah,
But his ones in Forest B selected 2 areas of that forest.
Mhm.
And in those areas where he selected to do his plots,
Mm.
it doesn't meet the representativeness criterion.
and what's your criticism about those plots?
They make up about 3% of the area. So they're about 800 metres square of a 2.7 hectare area,
How much, what percent?
about 3%.
Yeah,
And so what I'm saying is that those plots where he selected there aren't representative of this forest as a whole. What I'm saying is within these forests, there are areas of this forest that meet that representativeness criteria.
right, so did
And
you,
that the entire areas of these forests don't necessarily need to meet that criteria. There just needs to be enough of this forest that it has ecological integrity, moderate level of species, range of species to meet that criteria.
so where, what percentage of the area do you say meets that criteria?
It's been difficult for me to map that because of the way that I was undertaking my survey. So what I did when I did my survey is I took representative photographs as I went along, as much as I could through there. And then from that, I was able to map that 1/2 hectare in Forest B of dense forest that meets that criteria. In Forest A, I haven't mapped it, the amount, but that I noted that in that area there was the structure and composition of forest that would meet that criteria.
Right, so you've got 5,000 square metres in Forest B of a total area of
0.7 hectares.
2.7 hectares. So roughly 20%. And then in Forest B, A, you've got an indeterminate area.
Correct.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Payne? When you're doing these plots, is the idea that it's the location of the plots is supposed to be random, or is it supposed to be, or how would you go about selecting them to ensure representative and to ensure that you just haven't selected a plot to suit your purpose?
Exactly. So I would select my plots to test whether an area meets the significance criteria or not. So I would be selecting a plot to see, does this forest hold the values that would meet this criteria or not?
And
So I would select it to see if there was, say, a very discrete area of forest that did, and that wasn't representative of all the other area, then there would be a level of subjectivity to that to be able to understand whether it is or not and what that is over a given area. In this instance here, there is enough area that meets that representativeness and is sustains itself in its ecological function and is comprised of these forest tiers such that, in my opinion, it meets that criteria.
And this 5,000 square metres located within, that it is essentially different because of its impenetrability.
Correct.
So inverting that, you agree that 80% of Forest B is heavily modified by foraging and is not representative.
No, I don't. I agree that the 80% of it is modified on a continuum. Some parts are heavily modified, others less so.
Right.
When I say the parts that are heavily modified, those are the ones right on the edges, where you can start to see exotic species starting to come into the green field, pasture grass.
And the area of Forest A is how much?
About 4,000 square metres. Just over.
And that has an indeterminate area of non-modification.
Of less modification. And I think it's important to understand that in order to meet this one criteria, representativeness, a forest doesn't need to be totally intact, pristine, and the best example of forest.
No.
So when you say that, the applicant's ecologist is sort of saying that the forest next door would include most of the species you expect to see. So how many species are you seeing in Forest B when you say it's representative out of what you'd expect to see? And of course, they hadn't been modelling.
I haven't been able to measure all the species in there because I haven't done a lizard survey, an invertebrate survey, an extensive botanical survey trying to meticulously count the plant that occurs in there. I haven't done an extensive bird survey, extensive bat surveys haven't been undertaken. So there's a whole suite of biodiversity that hasn't been measured.
So when you're saying it's representativeness, it's representative.
Meets the representativeness criteria.
Yeah, okay. And so what are you actually saying there in terms of how many species does that actually, how representative is it? I suppose, what's the threshold where we say it's less than, it's less than 5% of what we'd expect to see here in terms of species diversity, or it's 55 or 100%.
So that this is really reflected under the diversity criteria.
Right.
What representativeness, in my view, looks at is more than just the biotic diversity. You're looking at the composition and the structure, fabric of the forest, and are all those components there. And in this instance, that was my assessment, was that these did comprise that, and to a moderate range.
Why is moderate the threshold?
That's what's been directed as the national policy statement on Indigenous biodiversity. Other words are used: typical. MPS also, under that criterion, directs an assessor to look at whether even after an area has been degraded, are these biological components recovering following? So you can take that into account.
So you say the word typical is in the statement itself.
That's in the RPS statement. And the RPS's definition for representativeness, it talks about typical for a forest. So,
I'm not quite sure how moderate translates to typical.
yeah, they're different,
Hmm.
because you have an RPS, NPSIB,
Hmm.
and so, my understanding of the way that our laws would be produced and how future plans will, across the country, that they will need to adopt the NPSIB process. Take that into regard with how they will set their significance criteria.
So they'll have to think about what they think is typical.
They'll need to consider what is a moderate range that currently looks at typical for representativeness.
Sometimes I think that, yeah, it's a complex, anyway. So you've answered that question. I probably have a claim to fame in the sense that I've walked virtually the entire finger of Area B, Forest B, on the eastern boundary. And it struck me as relatively sparsely understory, relatively sparse understory, with a noticeable absence of epiphytes. Actually, quite stark kahikatea trunks, typically.
Yeah.
Is that not what you saw?
It's not what I saw in the central part, absolutely not. I saw
So where is the central part that you're referring to in B?
we have a look in my supplementary response that I've provided, it's figure 2.
Because we have a map up there, maybe that we could all be on the same page.
And I provided the photographs to and how it changes.
Oh, I see. So figure 2 is this section of the eastern side in the centre. Okay, and where are the photographs you want to show us?
They're on the following pages. Your document? Yeah. Is that my document?
So that's plate 1 and plate 2?
Yes. Plate 1, plate 2, plate 3 shows that area that I describe and how it shifts from being, as you describe, less epiphytes and more degraded. There was an old fence line that was put in that forest, so cattle hadn't been able to get into there.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that.
So really dense supplejack in there, so they haven't been able to get in. And
Yeah,
then on the
I
other,
do recall that.
pardon?
I do recall the fence.
Yeah. So it's that area in there that in my opinion is typical of a forest that you would expect in this ecological district in the land.
No, it's helpful. I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
No, not that document.
Thank you. And you describe those as showing moderate diversity.
Moderate and also typical.
Yes.
But moderately typical.
What you do find when you walk through forests, so I explained in this last bit of information that I've provided that for 18 months of my career, I've walked around forests. I just, day in, day out, I was doing these forest reconnaissance plots. And to get to your plot, there were no tracks, you just had to walk through forest and bush bash and then, and this is the data set that is relied upon by myself and then referenced subsequently by Dr. Keesing and his evidence, that's what is uses. What you find when you walk through forests off a track is that there is fluctuation in diversity. There is quite an absence of understory plants that naturally occurs in areas, and even in our largest bits of forest where there's extensive herbivory or there's been changes, you know this depletion in areas. If you ever walk through forests on Stewart Island, you'll see that there is very little middle and ground here in those forests because they've been impacted in the past. Then you get really extensive ground ferns, generally Lumeria in there, and then you've got your big trees. And so you expect some changes through a natural forest. But if you look at plate 2 and plate 3 in particular, you can see quite clearly that these areas are dense.
So what in plate 3?
Yeah.
What size area is that?
That's within the area that I show on.
But it's a subset, so it's plate 1 and 2.
The area is consistent with those photos. The entire area, that's what I'm saying.
So the area of 4,000 square meters,
That pink area that I've generally mapped
contains a composition of plate 1, plate 2 and plate 3.
No, plate 2 and plate 3. Plate 1 is where it shifts. I was just illustrating that's the edge of that pink area as it shifts.
Right.
So it was important to show how that change, where there is that change. And so as part of the Section 92 report that I prepared earlier as part of this process, I requested that a 20 by 20 plot was undertaken to see is there does it meet this representativeness? Does it meet the diversity criteria?
Where did you want the 2020?
In that pink area where I've shown.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Could you do it 20 by 20? Let's have a look at this and understand what's going on. So we've got some objective data to measure it by, but that I haven't seen any information that wasn't provided.
Yes, because Dr. Bramley and Dr. Keesing say that methodology is not right.
Which methodology?
Selecting a portion.
Why is it not right?
Well, oh no, I'm not telling. I'm not saying
Well, why?
it is or isn't right. I'm just saying
Okay.
that Dr. Bramley says your approach is not representative, not a representative approach.
Yeah, I agree. It's not representative of the entire 2.7 area of forest.
Yeah,
But there is forest in there that meets that representativeness criteria.
yeah,
And there's enough of it there that it's self-sustaining and that it has ecological integrity. And
Yeah.
those are the measures that are used to determine that criteria. And then the surrounding forest, the surrounding, say 2.2 hectares of forest, that provides an important buffer to that area of forest. And so that 2.2 hectares of forest around it, that then meets, as you'll see, the other criteria. It provides an important buffer to a significant natural area.
natural.
It will meet the ecological context criteria. So, and with that in mind, then that entire area there would then meet the significant natural area definition. And that's, yeah, I don't want to talk about the intentions of why that was included, but it's my understanding is why the buffering side of it is used. So what were included is you would expect the margins of fragments to have less diversity because they are exposed to what is termed as edge effects when wind, light comes in and impacts areas, and you do see higher numbers of exotic species starting to invade on those margins where the system gets opened up but they provide an important function for those core areas and those significant areas within a forest.
Just quickly, I speak suggesting that Dr. Keating has put his plots in Forest B in the wrong place.
I wouldn't say the wrong place. He's selected areas in there that show that those areas where he's put them are degraded.
Surely though, if you just put your plot in the most diverse area, then you're just going to get the same result every time. It's going to be significant.
If it has those values, yeah.
And isn't the idea to get to randomly select those plots so that it gives an indication as to whether the whole area is representative or not?
No,
So what's the standard methodology in terms of plot selection?
I'm not aware of a standard methodology. What I'm aware of is whether we need to test if these values are present or not. If there are values within an area that meet the representativeness criterion. And I would say that the converse argument to that is if you only put your plots in the most degraded areas, then you'll never meet a significant criterion.
Mm.
And in this instance here, the plots where they were selected, in my view, were where the damage to the forest was greatest.
So what would be, I suppose, the method to try and, you've got one option here of selecting an area which has been, another option of selecting the most high valuable area. What would be the, how do you select a plot location which represents the whole area? You're saying you don't, you just check for if there's
You're showing that it exists on a continuum. Right. By doing numerous plots, you just should, in this instance, you'd show that it changes where stock impact is being greatest and less. But what we need to understand is, does this forest, does it meet that criterion or not? And it does in that central part.
Okay. And that goes to your point that there's always a continuum, or there's always change in a forest.
Absolutely.
From areas that have been grazed, not grazed in this instance. But this forest has those values.
It did when I did my assessment 2 years ago.
So is the scenic reserve the comparable vegetation pattern?
It's what you could use as a benchmark. That's what we term. So you look at it and yeah, absolutely. And you could use that as a benchmark, but that benchmark would show you again what pristine looks like and modified. And the purpose of the representativeness criterion is not, you don't have to meet that benchmark. It's just got to be typical of what's left in the ecological district under the RPS, or a moderate range of diversity under the NPSIB, or so not as one or the other, or ecological integrity. And in this instance, the centre of that forest has ecological integrity, and that's why it meets the NPSIB significance criterion for representativeness. And it's the same principle with forest art.
So what I've noted is that the crucial influencing point for you is ecological integrity as used in the NPSIB.
It's just what you have to measure. It's one of the two things that are assessed for you call them sub criterion within that.
Right.
They assess, does it have a moderate range of species,
yeah,
or ecological integrity. So in my section 92 report, I asked specifically for the applicant to assess ecological integrity in those areas. Wow.
Yeah, but your answer said that's where it's ecological integrity as used in the NPSIB that has led to your conclusion.
Yes, as well as the moderate range of species. It meets both of those sub-criteria in those areas.
And are those criteria the same in the RPS?
No.
They're not, right.
The RPS refers to it, I mean, I can read it out, but it's like a typical the ecological district. I can have it here. RPS representativeness says Indigenous vegetation or habitat of Indigenous fauna that is representative, typical or characteristic of Indigenous biological diversity of the relevant ecological district. This can include degraded examples where there are some of the best remaining examples of their type, or represent all that remains of Indigenous biological diversity in some areas. So as part of that, what you may want to consider, and again, this goes back to how I discussed what's remaining in this coastal plain is what we'd be looking at measuring. And so on private land, what remains of mature forest are small fragments. Largest is about 11 hectares, and then they ranged out to about 1,000 square meters. And then what's atypical of that is the Mananui Scenic Reserve.
Okay.
So when you're looking at that from an ecological district, that's what you just said, but you know, do you also look broader in the context of the entire region as well?
It would depend. It would depend on what you're measuring. So in instances like Kanuka forest or regenerating sterile forests on a typical landform, yes, you'd say how much have we got fauna? But when you've got more unique values that are driven by different and unique abiotic factors that drive that form and composition, then you need to compare like for like values. And so in this instance, I've used the ecological district. I haven't gone beyond the ecological district to see where lowland forest is being cleared. And then within that, I've then measured it up in that basis. So it's entirely appropriate to refine it to the landform, because both the regional policy statement and the national policy statement for Indigenous biodiversity both say for landform. And so
Landform or land environment?
Oh, actually, you might be right. Land environment. Yeah.
And so what's the land environment referring to? Is that the type of land, like with just before that coastal plain?
Yes.
Okay. And so if we looked at the land environment, it would include the entire west coast, coastal plain, would it?
Within the ecological district is where we're looking at. So you've got the land environment within the ecological district.
Right.
Which is where?
Which is where I've drawn in figure 2 of my evidence, or figure provided again in figure 4 of my supplement.
This is the ecological district.
The ecological districts is the white lines you might be able to see on that. So it will be the next figure. So the white lines are the ecological district. Blue area is the coastal plain. Those yellow areas are the fragments of forest that are left within that coastal plain. The big one that you can see on there is the Mananui Scenic Reserve. Little patches of other patches of mature forest that remain in there. And this is really typical of New Zealand as a whole. Our lowland areas have been highly modified. That's where the low-hanging fruit is. That's where farming is easy. Soils are generally more fertile. It's caused from clearing what was previously wetlands in lots of areas. And so biodiversity in lowland and particularly coastal areas throughout the whole country are greatly reduced. But I'm not looking at the whole country here. That's not what I'm doing. I'm looking at the ecological district.
And of those in yellow, only the site is under private ownership.
No, it looks like, I don't know the full what one, the private or public, but I do know that the Mananui Scenic Reserve is obviously public, and everywhere else seem to be working farms, so I made an assumption that that would be private land.
So this type of lowland forest is unique in that its soil composition is mainly sand. Is that what you're saying?
That's one part of it.
Yeah.
Also being where it's lowland is another aspect of it. It's proximity to the coast and therefore exposure to salinity.
Yeah.
And then also these micro or the temperatures down these areas also influence that.
So that all influences the diversity and species you're likely to see in that type of forest.
Exactly, it drives what's going to grow. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The abiotic factors form the biotic factors. And biotic factors feed off and form them as well.
So just to clarify, so in terms of the MBS IB criteria, we're talking about ecological context.
That is, so for ecological context, that no, not in this instance here.
Right.
What we're talking about here is, I'm just talking broadly of why this forest is different, but this comes down to rarity. So under the rarity criteria, this is what I'm talking in relation to the coastal plain. So the rarity and also representativeness, because representativeness refers back to, is it within an area with less than 20%? I'll have to have a look. There's a lot of overlapping stuff in this.
Not what I'm trying to understand, I think, is the ecological significance really depending on which scale on which we assess its significance? Or is it independent of that?
Scale absolutely falls apart into the rarity aspect of it.
Right.
Yeah, and then I'm just trying to see, I'll just double check under the RPS what it refers to. Oh no, sorry, they're both is around rarity. So the RPS says indigenous vegetation or habitat of indigenous fauna that has been reduced to less than 20% of its former extent in the region or relevant land environment, ecological district or freshwater environment. So in this instance here, we need to ask the question, has the indigenous vegetation been reduced to less than 20% of its former relevant land environment? And I'm saying it is, and that actually over 90% has been reduced. It's been reduced to, so that, and even, so there was some question around the subjectivity of my mapping, and I have used my professional judgment based on what Beryl had produced. But even if you took what Beryl has drawn in there and included the Mahinapua Lake, that's not a, and used the course mapping that he's provided, which isn't good science, there's still less than 20% of forests remaining within this relevant land environment. And therefore it meets, of mature forest, and therefore it meets this rarity criterion, as well as the representativeness and diversity and ecological context.
So
And it's,
you're saying there's rarity in terms of the land environment, coastal plain. What would the conclusion be if you took rarity at the scale of the ecological district?
it would absolutely not meet it. And in fact, the Mahinapua Scenic Reserve would not meet it because that would be less than 1% of what remains in this ecological district. There's over 60,000 hectares of mature forest in this ecological district. The Mahinapua Scenic Reserve would be 0.03% of that. So it wouldn't meet the rarity criteria. And if you took the rationale from Dr. Keesing and his assessment of significance of removing forest in that manner, you could clear the entire Mahinapua Scenic Reserve and it would be a negligible ecological effect.
So can you just help me understand in the NPSIB where it talks about the land environment? I'm looking at Appendix A there. And I just can't find the land environment, but you'll correct me.
depletion, rarity and distinctiveness criterion. Number 4 says depletion of indigenous vegetation or ecosystems is assessed using ecological districts and land environments.
So you're on page 35?
36.
36. And you look under what number, sorry?
4.
Oh. Okay.
And that's so that means it needs to be assessed. And it's appropriate to me because of the scenario I just described.
Where is it?
Yeah.
You also see it under 6D as well, just below.
And you said before, talked about the different abiotic factors and forming the biotic factors. And so, for example, soil type and forming different species in a forest. And so what, in layman's terms, what would we likely see differently in this sand dune forest than we would likely to see on the, 300 metres up on the hill?
I don't know the specifics around the differences in the diversity around that. You
Right.
need to do quite a complex study to understand that. And that would involve doing like these 20 by 20 plots, doing ordinations of them, seeing where there are those nuances. What I do understand is that with biology, there's immense complexity with this, and what we can measure and record doesn't necessarily reflect that understanding of that complexity. But what I do understand is that where there is clear differences in geology and soils and humidity, salinity, temperatures, these all influence those compositions.
So we have no,
And it's important to recognise that.
so we have no evidence that it is different, but you think it could be different. Because I think did you mention an author that you'd referred to that characterised these forests as different? No, maybe you didn't, but back to my first question. So is there any evidence to confirm that there is a difference between something 300 metres up a mountain and this coastal plains?
Yeah, I mean, there are some well understood concepts that they are very different in the way that particularly animals use them, how they flower, when they fruit. Think of it like areas that grow new season potatoes. They're down in warmer environments. This is like that for the animals as well. So they provide safe refuges in the winter times. They're warmer, and they just function differently to those more inland forests of similar types and composition, or would be expected to, based on the differences in abiotic influences.
And is the area in Forest A coloured in any map or plan?
I haven't covered them.
So you haven't identified that?
I haven't, no.
No.
As Forest A, is it likely to have similar values to the pink part of Forest B? Or
It's
depend on whether there's a fence there?
Yeah, it's more just when I was there. I mean, again, 2 years ago, it was more discreet because the area is a lot smaller. But there was a part of that forest that again had all those components that I described through seedlings, shrubs, epiphytes. It was typical of a forest. I stood there and I looked around and went, I'm in a forest. And before my site visit, I got there a bit earlier before meeting the applicant and the planner, and I went for a walk around the Mananui Scenic Reserve, and I found that was really useful, to look at that benchmark, recalibrate back on the tools, and then walk into these areas. And I mean, standing in the middle of Forest B, I mean, I could have sent you those photos and said, this is the Mananui Scenic Reserve. You wouldn't know the difference. I should have done that more to see Dr. Keane and see what he said, because you can see that it's dense forest, unmistakable.
Given the given how much the forest has been browsed out by stock or the stock damage, how long would it take for that to be restored, similar to the values that you're seeing in the pink area of Figure 2?
So some things take a long time to recover, but that biomass would come back in 10 years.
Right.
Easily.
All right.
We talked about this, I mean, if consent was granted to remove the forest, and I'm saying that's what we're doing. How do we compare, I suppose, the restoration which is proposed, which is new planting, which is going to be fenced and there's going to be management. That's going to take time to grow. And to achieve, the heights of these trees that could potentially be taken out. How do we compare the two in terms of one's going to have some, it's potentially going to have some more ecological integrity going forward, compared to one with some areas of existing integrity and maturity.
Some ecologists like to use really complex models based on assumptions. When you drill down into those assumptions, you can often find there's a bit of smoke and mirrors as part of that, and often get into great debates around proxies and all types of things. It's not easy, and I think in this instance here, my feel is that a 1-to-1 ratio, even with the vegetation direct transfer, will mean that the significant and really old values, they are the ones that are important and that are being lost, aren't being replaced as part of this. And in order to get a clear quantum and shift of that, what they did for the Mount Messenger project is that they provided 200 seedlings for each mature tree, or they called it a significant tree that was being lost. And when you look at that and actually plant that out following good practice, it amounts to about a 7-to-1 ratio. And for Transmission Gully, where there were mature forests and mature trees, and again, some impacted by stock, and as part of that, it also included collecting the forest soils and the duff and placing them in other areas. That was agreed upon at a 6-to-1 ratio. For Mount Messenger, for areas of intact forest, they applied it in a different way. They did pest management at a 16-to-1 ratio, but that pest management is in perpetuity. And so there's always different factors. What's winning, what's losing, what are the fauna? And these are the different points that you want to break up, and that's what comes into these biodiversity offset accounting models. If you were to take a simple approach and say, well, you think that it's reasonable, 200 seedlings mature tree, And as part of that, you could drill down into that. Well, what do we think is a significant tree versus others? Because not all of these mature trees, you would say, are highly significant. Some are younger than others. So generally, you look at that at about a 30 centimetre DBH, measure around how many of these do we have? Okay, let's do a 200 seedlings for each tree over 30 centimetres DBH, plant it out in that fashion, and again, put all the typical measures that are needed. So fencing, covenant that protects it in perpetuity, pest management so that for the first 5 years, and weed management so that you know it gets a closed canopy, and then you can walk away with confidence that you've got a functional forest.
Is it enough 5 years of pest management to ensure close canopy?
Can be in some areas.
Yeah.
Here it's quite cold, but again, it's close to the coast. I would suspect so. You might have some gaps, and you just do monitoring to see, you know, just to get 80% canopy cover is typically used as part of it, and that would be your objective. So you just do it until you get 80% canopy cover, and eventually it will become this self-sustaining environment.
And as part of the, I suppose, concern about the offsetting approach, is that you just don't know what's going to happen in the future. You don't know whether it's going to work or.
Offset. The criticisms of offsetting is often around the models at times are poorly understood, how people, again, the assumptions around them. Some values like trees that are, say, 200, 300, 400 years old, they're not being offset. It's compensation for those. You just can't replace those values in what they say an acceptable time frame under the MPSIB. And so it's more compensation for those types of values. And it's not appropriate for unique and threatened values as well, because you can't replace them with an offset. But it's
just going to take generations to get there, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of generations.
Yeah.
And there are principles in the MPSIB and the EPSFM which guide assessors on what needs to be considered as part of that, and that time lag is part of that. Yeah.
That's what I mean.
So if I take you to paragraph 38 and 39.
Others evidence or is
Of Dr. Bramley's peer review.
Yeah.
He says, for it to meet the representative criteria, it has to have at least one of the following attributes. Do you agree with that? What he says there?
Yes.
And then he says, in my view, they don't exhibit any of either of those attributes. And you say they meet both.
Definitely meets B. Processing A, if you were to look at it, typical of the character of the entire ecological district of the forest. That one there is, I find it's hard to characterize the ecological district. So in this instance here, the indigenous vegetation in the ecological district, I would say that it's not typical of the pristine forests and the thousands of hectares that occur in this ecological district.
But I thought you said that ecological integrity was one of the major legs of your assessment.
That's ecological. That's typical of the character of the ecological district. I'm just trying to tease that out a bit more. So the character of this ecological district here for this type of vegetation is fragments of forest within farming environments. What is atypical of it is the Mahinapua Scenic Reserve, in my opinion. And so I think that the ecological integrity within these fragments is typical of the character of the ecological district. Yes.
That's referring to the ecological district, though, not the land environment.
Correct. So in this ecological district,
Yeah.
what is typical of the character of the ecological district is that the lowland coastal area has been severely modified. And that character, the forests exhibit, yes, typical of ecological integrity, typical of the character of that ecological district. Absolutely.
Well, doesn't that statement say the forest has to have an ecological integrity typical of those types of forests in the ecological district?
Yes.
And he says, well, it doesn't.
He says that it doesn't, if you look at that, and I'm saying that the character of the ecological district, right? So that we've got to look at the ecological district.
No, it's not the character of the ecological district.
The indigenous vegetation that has ecological integrity that is typical of the character of the ecological district.
Yeah, so it's that
Okay.
it's the character of
Yes. So
that vegetation
yeah,
in the district.
I would
Does it
say-
have typical ecological integrity?
yes.
That's what it's asking.
Yeah, yeah, and that middle part where I've shown that half a hectare, absolutely. It's a typical of any mature
Which is
land forest.
a different question from, well, is it typical
The, yeah,
of privately owned land
yeah,
where these
Yeah.
things exist, which is a different.
understood. Yeah, understood. So, but yes, that patch of forest in there that hasn't been modified by stock, that isn't influenced by edge effects, that is dense, has all those components that I've just described, in my opinion, it is typical of the character within the ecological district, and this ecological district has lots of mature forest, and it's typical of mature forest, absolutely.
But how can you disagree about ecological integrity?
I don't. I say that this area in here has ecological integrity.
So you say the difference between us lies in where they define the area.
Within the forest itself, within forest.
Are you saying the difference doesn't lie in our interpretation of what is ecological integrity, but lies in the fact that they're looking at the area of Forest B generally, whereas you're looking at the small area?
Correct. Yes.
Right. So that the difference lies in that location.
I would have to make that assumption because neither Dr. Bramley or Dr. Keesing have made any reference to this dense interior or measured it in any way. And I put some emphasis of why, without, in absence of doing a 20 by 20 meter plot, what I would expect to be, why I think it has ecological integrity is that it contains species that are highly susceptible to degradation. It has a high abundance of filmy ferns. It has the world's largest moss grows in there, amongst others. And that's typical. If you've got ecological integrity, those types of species are the first to go.
So is there any guidance in terms of, the difference here is, you're saying it's got, there's part of it that's got ecological integrity. They're saying, well, overall, they don't think it does. Is there any guidance as to what that's supposed to be? Is it supposed to be overall, or is it supposed to be, this is a bit of it?
I've interpreted this as, does that exist here? Is there forest with ecological integrity? And I walked over it and said, yes, there is. Yes, this is forest with ecological integrity. Yeah. And it has, I expect it to have ecological integrity in there because it isn't subject to edge effects because of the wide 50-metre band to the west of it that protects it from the prevailing winds, and the eastern side is very close to the riparian forest of Whare, so it's quite protected in that little bit there from those light and wind effects. And then it hasn't been able to be impacted by stock because it was so dense with epiphytes and as you see the fence. A few more criteria to traverse as well.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Okay. So you just say Dr. Bramley's wrong in both counts.
Yes.
So three ecologists walk through the same area and two say, no, not enough ecological integrity to be called typical. And
I agree with them that those other areas that I've looked at are typical. I agree with them, but
right.
they haven't focused their assessment on the part of forest that does have.
Okay, so
if you'd perhaps
so can I summarize it this way? Of the 4.7 hectares, your area of disagreement relates to an area of 5,000 square metres.
And then it would be a part of that 4,000 square metres of forest as well, which I haven't defined.
Well, if you haven't defined it, I'm struggling to give a number to it, which I need to characterise.
I could have a quick look, but I can quickly draw it up if you like.
So
well, it would be in the order of 1,000 square metres of it.
right, so let's say more or less 6,000 square metres of 4.7 total.
As an approximation.
Which translates to.
But I agree.
So 1/8.
I agree that all those other forest fragments on that side do not meet that representativeness criterion or any of the other criterion. I don't disagree with them. It's just these two patches here that are more intact.
Yes, well, that's comforting because I can't. Well, there are parts on the northern part of the site that are highly degraded.
Yeah.
They've been smashed. So I understand what you're saying. That makes more sense to me. But in numerical terms, it is 1/8 of the area that you say is an SNA.
No, I'm saying that the 2.7 hectares of Forest B and all the 4,000 square metres of Forest A are because whilst that inner part meets that representative, all the surrounding vegetation of that provides an important buffer for it. So though that vegetation around those areas meets criterion, the ecological criterion.
Significance.
Significance criteria.
What criteria?
Ecological context. The forest around those parts there meet that criteria. And so therefore that whole patch then gets pulled into it.
Right, so let's just deconstruct that a little bit. As I understood it, are you saying it's a buffer from cows, or is it a buffer from something else?
It's a buffer from light and wind.
Now, when I look at the edge of Mananui Scenic Reserve, I don't see a lot of edge effects. In fact, you're looking at a wall of vegetation.
Yeah.
I don't understand why. Is it because 5,000 sitting alone might be subject to more wind and light elements?
The reason behind it is that the edges were all cleared by farming activity in the last few years. Yeah, so it would have had a similar density and similar wall and similar integrity, but those margins were cleared.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why are they important now?
Why are they important now? Because the remaining parts that weren't cleared, the indigenous vegetation, are still serving those purposes of minimising light and wind exposure to the areas that have integrity. There's still vegetation in between those areas. Yeah, that's serving that important buffer.
But you get to significance on the scenic reserve. In other words, I'm just not sure why the edges that are not significant become significant. Why is that?
Because they provide an important buffer. And that's the measure of the ecological context criterion.
Okay.
Does it provide an important buffer to an area that meets a significant natural area criterion? And I'm saying these bits that are intact meet that representativeness criterion, albeit small and not large areas, of course. And that the vegetation, the indigenous vegetation around it provides an important buffer for that, and therefore it meets that criterion. But if we zoom out in a wider landscape level, we'll also note that I have assessed that these patches of forest also provide an important partial buffer to what we all agree is a significant natural area, which is the Tuwhariwhari riparian forest in there, because they're in such close proximity to them. If you were to clear those forests, 500 metres worth, then that forest there will be highly exposed to wind and light, well, wind being the main one. So
yeah, so I don't see much problem with wind.
It causes desiccation into an area.
Yeah.
It opens up the system, and then it allows more weeds to get into those areas, and it changes that composition. What's important about our forests is humidity, being cold, shady, humid environments.
And in terms of elevation, if the vegetation principally is found on the escarpment at a significantly higher elevation, how does it buffer?
I'm not sure if it does. I'm pretty sure that it doesn't actually. No, for these forests here, in front of this forest here, definitely provide a wind buffer to that there. Absolutely. They're about 20 metres tall in parts. And they're only 20 metres away, 30 at the most, and about 10 metres is closer to the forest beat of the Tuwhariwhari riparian market. It absolutely provides that buffer to wind. And you can see that that change in effect in forest B. So you would expect a similar shift in degradation to the two whare. And it is important. Absolutely. And it only needs to be a partial buffer to meet that context criteria.
Yeah,
It needs to be a full buffer.
but along the escarpment, along that boundary, there'll be areas which are protected from wind and those that are not. And do we see a difference?
I haven't done an assessment of it. I can't tell you. But I have seen when edges of forests are removed, that where that forest once was, you now get those degrading effects into the new edge. Edge effects are well understood. The reason, I mean, again, I think I said it earlier, but the reason why that this part of Forest B in particular it's really good is because it's on the eastern side of it. I also, and we have a difference in opinion here between Dr. Keesing, Dr. Bramley and myself, is that I think that these provide an important linkage and are functionally contiguous between the Mananui Scenic Reserve and Whare. Full suite of forest values can disperse through those areas there. Take that away, that dispersal is reduced. Some birds will be able to fly back and forth, but maybe less so, the importance of which hasn't been measured. It's very difficult. It'll be difficult to measure what that importance is to those species. But for plants, fungi, insects, and of lizards, geckos in there, these patches definitely provide a functional stepping stone and linkage between those patches of forest. If you remove them, what's left is gets down to about 20 metres or less of forest as it links on to the Mananui Scenic Reserve. It's a very thin strip. So for anything that's not a bird that can fly across, you're then highly exposed to this new margin. Some things can't go through there. Some animals need to go through, or insects need to have shading in higher environment, forest environments. Or for lizards, they need complex cover. They need to have refuge to be able to disperse between areas. But as Dr. Keesing said, this stuff is really difficult to, he thinks it's really difficult to measure this, and it can be, but when I was on site, I was watching birds flying in between these patches all the time.
Oh,
but it's around the importance of it though, is the key thing here.
Yeah.
And I think that would be, yeah, rightly so, quite difficult, but you could do surveys to show this. So again, it's around judgment, and I think it's reasonable to assume, given their close proximity, that they provide an important linkage, and if they are left, and the context of what's left if you take them away, I think it's reasonable to assume that.
So, leaving aside birds, you say fungi and lizards, if they're present, potentially.
Various plant species, how they disperse between them. Yeah.
When
Particularly,
you say disperse, you mean
move from one place to another.
they transmit their
Yeah,
DNA.
exactly.
Well, by definition, any area, even the degraded parts, could become potential habitat for species by transmission, couldn't they?
It's about the linkage. So it's not about potential habitat. It's about, do they facilitate this linkage between two significant areas? So we've said Mananui Scenic Reserve, without a doubt, significant. Whare Creek, significant. Does something provide an important linkage between SNAs? And I'm saying these patches of forest are important linkages for numerous species.
Yeah, but
Because if removed, they may not be able to disperse between these two areas anymore.
What's the boundary between the scenic reserve and Te Wharewhare? The length of boundary.
It's a L shape. So where are you measuring across? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying,
It's
does Mananui Scenic Reserve run across the edge of Te Wharewhare at any point?
I'll have a look at that. I'm struggling to understand what you're asking me here. Shape and
Sorry.
maybe figure 5 of my supplementary information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's look at figure 4.
Yeah.
So there's a section where the scenic reserve connects with Te Wharewhare.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm just trying to understand why that wouldn't be the more important linkage.
Because you get down to a bottleneck, if you want to keep going further north, within to that forest of Te Wharewhare, further north of that area there. That's what I'm saying. Try to get up into that patch of forest, up into there. You'll then, if you're a terrestrial species trying to get into that area, you're then left with a thin 20-metre strip, needed to be at most. And I'm saying that these patches of forest facilitate that dispersal there, and it's reasonable to assume that it is important for some species.
I think you should have a break. So we'll break for 15 minutes. If you rest and
Thank you.
again. You've relied on the Barrel Coastal Plain.
Representativeness.
Yes.
No,
For distinctiveness, is it?
or rareness.
Or rarity? So does that mean for representativeness, we should not consider the coastal plain map? We should focus on the ecological district?
Need to focus on the character of the ecological district. What we're for the ecological integrity aspect of it.
Yeah.
So as part of that, you need to ask yourself, what is the character of this ecological district?
Mm-hmm.
The coastal plain, the character of that within the ecological district. So in this ecological district, the coastal plains character is one of high modification, where the patches of forest, indigenous vegetation here. This is what we should be measuring in. Yeah. You could also, I think you could also look at it if you wanted to just say, what is the character of this ecological district? Or it's one of indigenous vegetation that is pristine in all areas across it. And you could look at it in that respect. Either way, these areas have forest that has representativeness of mature forest. It means mature forest. If you want to look at in the whole ecological district or just the coastal plain, they definitely have ecological integrity that's typical of the ecological district.
So turning to paragraph 41 of Dr. Bramley's statement.
Yes.
And in paragraph 42, he says, Barrel's maps do not map the coastal plain, but define the limit of the Holocene coastal environment and the wider, more generalised geomorphological coastal environment. Do you agree with that statement?
I'd have to read Barrel's report again.
Okay.
As I imagine, I've used this as an initial guide and understanding to see the soil types in here, and then also what would be expected within this environment where other abiotic factors influence, trying to compare like for like values. That's the purpose of the exercise, to ensure that you're not inadvertently skewing your assessment because the ecological district and other landforms that have forest on them influence this here. That's why I've done it. And because this area here has different soil types under it that are unique.
Is it possible, though, with a dominant canopy cover, which comes down from older geological areas, that the degree of composition and change is only ones of variation but not substance? In other words, the forest type is adapted to those conditions but doesn't exhibit ecological variation of significance.
Yeah. The significance is also how these forests function. So being lowland areas and close to the coast, and I gave that example of looking at like where new season potatoes are, and these forests here act as your new season potatoes for the insects, the birds. These are the areas that seasonally are different to those further inland as well. So that's where there's an important difference between inland forest or high altitude forest and lowland forest. And taking that together with the soil types that may or may not cause a substantial variation in the composition, my understanding of basic forest ecology and biology is that it would have an influence, but those influences may be nuanced, but that doesn't mean that they're not important.
So just to break that down a bit, because I'm not entirely clear I followed that, and that may be my fault. Are you saying with the new season's potato metaphor, which I somewhat missed, that there is a functional difference in their environment as opposed to an intrinsic biodiversity difference?
Well, when you look at biodiversity, you're not just looking at plants or that structure of that forest. Yeah, you're also looking at the animals as well. Yeah, and what I'm saying is that the animals in this area here, what happens is all the birds come down to these lowland areas when the kahikatea start flowering and fruiting earlier, or the kamahi starts flowering earlier. Insects start to come out of the ground earlier. It brings in the fantails and all the insectivorous birds, and they move around in the landscape as you know they always have to follow the seasons. And these lowland areas, they function and behave different to the inland ones.
Right. So that it's that functional difference. Yeah.
There could quite well be nuanced variations in what you'd see in the Mahinapua Scenic Reserve being underneath those sands, and if you were in more rocky or different type soil types as well. But you'd need to do quite an extensive study, I would show, to show any significant differences between them. I used to have to do them, and they were awful. You do an ordination and then throw it through statistics to see.
No, I understand your potatoes point now. Okay, so where are we going to go to now? We're still in significance. we've done representativeness. Rarity we've touched on.
Yes.
Ecological context. In a sense, all these merge into one in a way. They're different lenses to the same thing, aren't they?
Can be. I mean, not really. I think so. I think they're quite different in how you interpret it or how you assess each of these criteria. Definitely the diversity and representativeness has a lot of overlap between those two there, but ecological context is very different. You could get some.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, and rarity is very different as well. Rarity here, well, I think we have. Well, I've explained how I've come to assess this as meeting that criteria.
Mm.
And that's because I was directed by the land environment.
Yeah.
To consider that. And Dr. Keesing and Dr. Bramley don't consider the land environment in their assessments.
All right. But an element of diversity and representativeness would also need to be present to qualify for rarity, in a sense, wouldn't it? So they do feed into each other. They are. Some things have to be present as basic elements.
Yeah. So we've got mature forest here. That's what I'm saying. Got some mature forest in these areas.
Mm.
Yeah. And that, yeah, over 90% of that has been lost already. And if you took a more broader scale, and perhaps my mapping of the area is incorrect and you want to take some more variation, I'm confident that the lowland areas that are like for like resource and comparable forests, mature forests in this ecological district, that over 80% has been lost.
Mm.
And that's the measure.
Yeah. And so if we return to Dr. Keesing's statement, and we look at the aerial photographs, which are found
Yeah. Page 21.
Yeah, but I thought the one that was most interesting maybe it was in the ecological assessment rather than the evidence. There's a photograph from 1980s.
Oh yeah, yeah, I'm familiar with
That,
that photograph.
that is,
Section 92 response section. Ecological.
I think I've got that photograph. 1981.
yeah,
Yeah, I've got that aerial. Yeah.
okay. Unfortunately, I can't locate it, but
Under attachment K, under further information.
oh yeah, attachment K.
Under
Which number? K.
Mananui ecological assessment.
Yeah. Summary? Sorry. Yeah.
Under the further review.
Oh.
Let's cut down part.
ATTK and Mananui ecological assessment.
So pages 11 to 12, is it?
112 pages.
Oh no. What page is what I'm looking
What
for?
page are we on? Oh yeah, here we go. So
But that's the way.
Can I just have a look at what you're looking at? So just-
So it's extra, it's sort of fascinating. This one here. That we,
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I saw in that photograph, particularly the 1980s one, was very evident chipping away by farming and foraging of the various components of the forest, including forest fee. And my observation was that some of those structural elements of those processes of destruction were still evident in the structure and composition of the forest.
I think if I'm right, are you referring to the fact that there may have been selective logging of the large emergent trees? Is that what you suggested?
Well, not only logging, but I just think that you can see that effectively there was far more access to stock. I mean, what happens is when I came in to the site, Forest B looked like a monolithic piece of bush. When you penetrate it, you actually find strands of grass, all sorts of tracks and so forth. So and that has arisen from this activity that we see in these 1980 photographs.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is that those structural changes to the physiology of the forest are still evident.
Yeah,
as you work through.
absolutely, yeah, but it's also been driven by much more recent and intensive land use has also driven that. Absolutely, but yeah, there's been a big gap being broken up through the middle of it. Yeah. I don't dispute it. I don't dispute that a lot of these areas and as you said, there's only part of it that's still that's that ecological integrity. Yeah, that's just the.
Yeah, it was just a photograph that really struck me about.
Yeah, you can. I'm looking at it now. It's where I've pushed up.
So I'm just trying to find. You say it's an attachment K?
Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an attachment K, which I'm not sure.
Page 12.
Yeah, but it's under the further information tab on the website. That's where you're going in from.
No, I'm not going from there.
Yeah, I'm looking at that 81 here.
Just wondering why my page 12 of attachment K doesn't show that.
There'll be more than one attachment K, so the attachment K is updated.
I know we'll get to it at some point, but this photograph is very useful in terms of understanding natural and land wetlands as well. It's worth revisiting.
Well, we'll get to that topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so where do you say in that photograph the area is that you now say is still okay?
I'd have to overlay it, but and looks like can I bring my laptop?
Yeah.
This area here, really dense in there.
Just here?
Yeah, maybe. But I could overlay them and then do a check, but yeah.
Would you mind?
Yeah.
That
would take a bit of time.
Oh, okay. So a bit of orthography.
Yeah.
But even that area there is quite changed in terms of its structure, isn't it? There's a bit that's not as much, but it's a relatively small component.
Yeah. Yep. But there's still forest in there that has ecological integrity.
Right. All right. Did you have any other questions?
You can also see that photo is really good for showing how untouched Forest A was as well. That fragment there is.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So across a range of criteria, you don't agree with Dr. Keesing, Dr. Bramley. And is that principally with an eye to the criteria in the MPSIB? In other words, would your assessment change if you were applying the RPS?
No, my assessment wouldn't change. My assessment is that it meets the RPS criteria as well. Criteria, yeah. Doesn't meet all of them though.
No.
There is a difference between the two.
Yeah.
And then again, under the district council, again, yeah, exactly. Or potentially too, if there are threatened animals in there, but we can get to that.
But otherwise, it's the representativeness.
Distinctiveness under the district.
Distinctiveness.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you know, I have to make assumptions for threat, and I make those assumptions. I mean, we can get into why, and it would lead into the lizard stuff, but it's just when
Why don't we go to lizards now, because it sort of naturally comes out of the terrestrial topic.
Yeah. So I reviewed Mr. Turner's report and struck me immediately around the paucity of devices used across this site. And I go into quite some detail in my response, what's typically expected from a lizard surveyor, what's needed in order to have a reliable level of confidence around lizards occurring within an area. And the reason being, it's focused on skinks. So in this district, there are some really important skink species that live in grassland. They live on margins of farms. And they can occur in very small areas. And so that's what needs to be surveyed on the site here.
Right.
And that hasn't been done. And the survey that was undertaken, Mr. Turner used tracking tunnels. There's been some recent research that looked at tracking tunnels and pitbull traps and their efficacy, and it showed promising results with that. It was okay, but it's not a standard protocol. And so, I mean, the jury's still out around it. And when you do use tracking tunnels, you need to check the card every day or every second day. So Mr. Turner left them for 10 days. 10 of his tracking tunnels got damaged, and the other 30, he said that there was too many footprints on there to see whether there were any lizard footprints on there. He spaced them at about 100 metres apart when they're looking at the forest margins. And when you do these surveys, you need to have numerous devices. Typically what you do on a really big site is you make sure you've got enough replicas of each of the different habitat types. You cluster devices together and you subsample as best as you can. You can miss things, particularly with lizards, and sometimes it takes a long time to actually record a lizard when it's in an area as well. Last year, I was using 225 devices, and it wasn't until check 23 over a 2-month period, I found a rare lizard. So up until that point, I caught 800 lizards, and then I caught a rare one. Blew me away. I couldn't believe it, that after all of this time and all of this effort, there was a rare lizard in that area. And I think the methods that he's done just, I couldn't get any meaningful conclusion from it regarding the importance of the site for skinks, whether they're there or not. So what I'm saying and what I said in my section 92 report was need to do a survey of the site across all the habitat types, do a thorough job so that you can ensure that these very high ecological value species are not within this area. Because if they are, they, you haven't found them like in the there, that effect is it's too high. These are nationally critical species, the highest threat level, and they occur. I mean, they were found because they just incidentally, and they thought it was the more common grass skink species. And then Kapatea skink, it's got a prehensile tail, like a monkey, and what on earth is this all about? And they used to live in shrubland, that type of environment. Now they've been reduced to where they can survive, and that's just a consistent story for our native fauna. They're not where they want to be, they're where they can survive. And so you often find skinks just in whatever remaining refuge there is. You don't often see them in areas where there's been continued and intensive managed pasture. So I agree, you're not going to find them in there, but you do find them on the margins in areas where stock haven't been or there's been consistent management for a long period of time. I make an example in this supplementary response where I was working on a 600-hectare dairy farm, pivot irrigated, far more highly intensively managed than this site. And right in the middle of the site, the tiny little scrap of refuge in there was a population of skinks. And they must have just been able to persist and persist in this area. I was blown away that they were able to do that. And so what I'm saying for this application is that this just needs to be understood better. It needs a proper survey for this site. With regards to geckos,
we did see all these cards all over the site.
Artificial cover orchids.
So they've been using ACOs.
Yes, there's I think 82 of them.
82.
On track to, yes.
So you'll also note in my responses for a site a lot smaller than this with a less potential habitat, we used 500 ACOs and 200 minnow traps. Effort is important when it comes to lizards. I'm not saying that necessarily needs to be here, but it's nuanced work, and they occur in microhabitats. And so you need to be confident that when you do a survey like this, that it's done thoroughly and that you've covered the site, it's got adequate coverage, and you're also sampling all the potential habitat types. After such a survey, if you don't find a sausage, then it's fine. You understand this well. But where you've got species of such high importance that it occur in the district, that habitat type for them is present, it's important that potential effect is well understood.
Yeah, I think it's been undertaken by herpetologists. Wildlands.
Okay.
I guess that's.
I haven't seen the data.
Well, the data's still a study in process. So.
Okay. Yeah, it can be done well at times or not, and there's it's a newly emerging, evolving science with herpetology, and a lot of what's understood at the moment is really boiled down to individual herpetologists. Over the 10 years, I think I put in my evidence here, I've noted how many lizards I've caught and how I've been doing this extensively, thoroughly throughout the country. And over that time, I learn more and more. And that's not necessarily reflected even in DOCS protocols. So I mentioned that I did a year's worth of study on lizards, and the purpose of that was to show that the DOC protocols at the moment at times are inappropriate for some species in the way that you're meant to serve. But what I showed was that using ACOs in cooler months outside of what they deem as the active period, I actually started catching more lizards than within. So what I'm trying to get across is that it needs to be done well, and it's got to be well understood, and it should be done by somebody with a permit for this ecological district. And I think if somebody has a permit for this ecological district, DOC's technical advisors have gone through that process, then that's quite a high endorsement that this person knows what they're doing.
So that's an independent qualification process.
It's not a qualification. You just get permission to capture and handle lizards because they're protected species. You're not allowed to handle native lizards, and this is permission to do that, and it's broken down within each district or region. So this is something that I noted there, how many permits I've had over the years in various areas.
Yeah. Do you have any questions about this?
No.
Just a couple of questions. This may seem like a silly question, but how do they really know how many exist when they're so hard to find?
So you can do way you do it is that you put your devices in grids very close together, about 2 meters apart, and then you can measure density, and you go out and you check it and you check it again, and then you can do a statistical analysis called the Lincoln-Peterson Index.
Right.
And from that, you can then extrapolate out the density of lizards within an area. But that method is hard. It's hard to do when you've got low density species. On lizards, the key point of difference that I have with Dr. Keesing is that with arboreal geckos on this site, there is some really good habitat for them. The kiki, the climbing epiphyte that is up some of these tall trees, and the tall trees themselves provide really good habitat for them. They're very small animals, highly camouflaged, really hard to find at the best of times. You can do effective surveys in smaller stature forests like Kanuka forest, Manuka forest, where they're lower to the ground. Use binoculars, really high powerful head torches, a couple of, well, there's someone doing their PhD using drones at the moment to detect them, and it has higher success. It sounds like it's a good method, but it's really hard to find them. And
But wouldn't you actually try and locate them in the areas that you say are most vegetated?
you'd be looking for geckos in the forest. They live in the forests.
But wouldn't you expect to do that principally in your areas of the 5,000 and 1,000?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
That's where you would concentrate your effort, isn't it?
absolutely. Yeah, that's the only area you'd be looking for them in those there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So geckos have been found. The West Coast green gecko, which is a threatened, actually vulnerable species, was found presumably incidentally next door in the reserve or just by the coast in there. There's a record of them there. Those types of records indicate that there's likely to be a population within the area. Like if somebody can stumble across one, unless they knew what they were doing, there's probably quite a few of them around the area. And given that there's several hectares of suitable habitat in this, in these forest fragments, I'm less concerned about the northern one. It's just really forest A and B that to me, I looked at them and went, "It's pretty good stuff for up." And so, with it on that scale, and considering how tall these trees are and the difficulties of reliably being able to find them in there, but we know that they occur nearby, that there's lots of habitat. I think that there's a degree of uncertainty that warrants taking a precautionary approach And that is directed under the National Policy Statement of Indigenous Biodiversity. When it's uncertain and you've got a species that's threatened, then a precautionary approach should apply. So if we assume that, now Dr. Keeson was saying, well, look, they're going to be appropriately managed, we'll chop the trees down and we'll shift them over, and in doing so, it'll be fine, we'll protect them. I disagree with that. I think the size of these trees, if you cut them down, there's a likelihood that they'll die at that point. They'll either if they're on the wrong side, they're going to get crushed. If not, they're going to get flung out. And when they're on the ground, so I've seen this before because I've been involved with searching through the crowns of trees for, I estimate, 40 to 50 hours consistently searching through trees that have been felled looking for arboreal lizards. And when they're in there, what we found is they stay in there. They kind of stay, or they go into these weird spots. They might come into like a little bit of understory, and they're highly exposed at that point. And because they're not fast moving, they've relied on camouflage. They're vulnerable to predators, really vulnerable. They'll get picked off. So if they don't, let's say they survive the first part, unless you're systematically searching and trying to find them, which hasn't been suggested so far, then there is, in my opinion, that they'd get picked off by a predator. And the loss of threatened geckos like that, again, is a significant effect. So I've taken a precautionary approach to it in my assessment, and given the uncertainty of them being there. And I think it's a precautionary approach would be to not cut the potential habitat down for them. That would be the best way to manage lizards and for this site, or for arboreal geckos anyway, or for West Coast green gecko, is to not cut down habitat that may inhabit them.
But which are the ones that, is it the Hokitika skink that you're saying is really?
Wapiti and Hokitika skink are very rare. They're known some just like discrete populations of them.
So they're discrete populations.
Yeah.
So
But the thing is with lizards and these ones here, that they only got found chance. You know, people aren't doing systematic surveys for lizards. They crop up and then they go, this one looks a little bit different. And then, oh, lo and behold, we've got a new species here that's different.
But is the Hokitika skink or the Kapatia skink known to be in this location?
And yes, nearby in the district, yes. You know, they're relevant is what I'm saying. They're relevant, yes. And because they occur in thick pasture margins.
Was there a gecko as well? You've mentioned in your evidence?
There are two geckos that could occur on the site. So there's forest gecko, and then there's the West Coast green gecko. Forest geckos are at risk, so less important, still important, of course, still an element of rarity to them, but it's the West Coast green gecko which is threatened, which is really important. And that's the gecko that has been found next door, 500 metres away.
In the Mananui bush. Okay. So more survey, but you say better still precautionary.
I'm saying more survey effort for skinks. And I think that won't be able to do a survey that will be able to give an acceptable degree of confidence whether West Coast green gecko occur in these forests. We currently don't have the methods that would allow for that.
How was it discovered in the first place?
West Coast green gecko.
Yeah.
Because they occur, people see them in forests.
But if they can be seen in forests, why can't a survey effort show them?
So you find some, but you don't find all of them. And if you've got some of them up in an area that is 20 metres above, 15 metres up in a canopy, and you look, you don't find. I've been a part of surveys where I've spent 3 days looking at, it was 12 or 13 kānuka trees that were only 15 metres above the ground. And I spent 3 nights looking for them, and I didn't see any. We chopped them down and put them to green gecko.
How does ecology deal with the question? It's significant because we can't be sure. We can't prove where something does or doesn't exist.
I know that's a hard one. So in this instance here, we have them occurring nearby. And then we've got a lot of habitat. So it's those factors that are into play here. If there weren't nearby records of them, or the habitat was small, then the likelihood is a lot lower. The likelihood goes up when we know that they occur nearby and that there is lots of good habitat for them.
But doesn't it also go that because they're threatening and nationally vulnerable, it means there's very little of them?
Yeah.
In other words, someone must have made an estimation of their distribution and density.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So doesn't it also follow that
The likelihood is low that they will occur in the area. That does come into play. But then when there's uncertainty, a precautionary approach should be taken.
So how could you possibly make an accurate estimation of how many there are when it's just so hard and there's no reliable survey to
There's a national database that's used.
Yeah.
And people use their survey efforts and how many geckos you find within an area with systematic searching, and then that can for geckos, and then that's how you can draw some conclusion from it. But I'm not privy to how DOC have determined that.
But the reality is we just don't know. But based on the information you do know, there's a way of estimating it
from the information available, and then expertise, so that the most eminent scientists in herpetology get together, and then this is how they make the threat classifications. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't disagree with the threat classification for these animals.
So Mananui bush, is that equivalent habitat?
Better.
It's better. Why is it better?
It's larger, it's more contiguous, it's got better microhabitats, more of them, it's more intact. It's harder for predators to get into those areas, deep into them. It's better habitat than these fragments, absolutely.
And is there a methodology of inferring incidents from the coexistence of other less unhelpfully cryptic species?
With skanks, I think there is. Yeah, because they can occur at quite high abundance, and they quite a few species have overlapping niches, right? So
yeah, so what I'm saying in Mananui, are there a whole lot of skinks as well?
So skinks typically, some species inhabit denser forests, but they typically live in more open environments, the species around us in this area here. So forest edges, so where there's basking opportunity, they have a range of different environments that they need at different times of the year and in different situations. Somewhere warm, somewhere cold, somewhere moist, somewhere, that type of stuff.
But my question is there like with the West Coast green gecko, does it coexist with other geckos?
Yes, with forest gecko, but they live in slightly different areas of the forest.
Right. So they're different species because they've found their own niche, but they are found with other geckos. And so if you didn't find other geckos,
It doesn't.
are you less likely to find?
No, it doesn't work.
Doesn't work that way?
No, you just, you'll find, the likelihood is that you may have a couple of these things in these forests. It may occur, you just don't know. And you won't know until it's too late, until you cut them down and hope that they survive.
Okay, so can't eliminate the possibility of an outlier gecko in that location.
Can't completely discount.
Okay,
And the methods to minimize the effects aren't sufficient to protect them in this context.
right. So a 20-meter tree falling down is not gonna, we're not gonna likely to survive it.
If they're on the wrong side of the tree, no.
Well, even if they're not, it's a big impact.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So that's the lizards. And then we're coming to the remaining issue, which is wetlands, natural and inland wetlands. Is that where you think we are?
Yep. I think for this one, my supplementary response would be the most useful to refer to. The images in there are quite telling.
Yeah. Okay. Yep, I have that. Thank you. Mhm. Right. So which section do you want us to go to?
Could be good just to firstly explain how I approach this aspect. So before going to site, I talked to Dr. Keesing about the application, and I reviewed aerial photographs before talking to him. And in reviewing those aerial photographs, I initially saw wetlands all through the site. And then I was surprised that they didn't meet the MFE wetland delineation protocols. So I talked to Dr. Keesing and he said that they are all pasture. So, okay, right. I went to site. When I first arrived on site, I was with the applicants and we stood up on by the walkway. It's like a little platform up there, and I was looking down, and as part of that, I pointed out an area that was visibly wet and dominated by non-pasture species, and said that this area here meets the wetland delineation, natural and land wetland definition. That was met with skepticism, which is fine. And so then the next step was, when I was doing my assessment, is I followed the wetland delineation protocols as 100% as directed. So the first thing is to do a rapid test. Is there an area of species that are, they call them facultative, fact wetland and obligate? Would you like me to describe how the protocols work, or
Do you
I can
need
do it.
to, I've actually done a 2-week-long case in the Environment Court.
Okay.
I'm
So-
sorry about it, but do you want to hear about it? You understand it?
Yeah, I read the classification last.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So you've got species that are adapted to wind conditions and have been there.
So the rapid test is basically, are they dry, is it wet, or is it?
Yeah, is it dominated by wetland species.
Yeah.
That's your first step there, and that's not always reliable, particularly in farmland. You can have induced areas, you can have areas that have been pugged out and bashed up, and then plants like water pepper and buttercup crop up, but they're not natural inland wetlands, those areas, but they can be perceived that way. And there's been a lot of frustration from ecologists and councils and people alike around these areas being captured as natural inland wetland. And I'll admit, I share those frustrations, and I listened to Dr. Keesing describe this type of scenario, and the intent, or perhaps his views, I definitely shared some of them. But what's important is ensuring that we play the cards that are in front of us, and that we follow these protocols and ask the question, does it meet these definitions or not, following these protocols? So in the first instance, and this is wetland, you'll see it on page 22, that was the area I was just describing first, where there was wetland vegetation.
So just a conscious question there. Do you think the protocol are on the money in terms of describing wetlands?
Yes, they definitely tell you if you've got a wetland or not, if you follow them correctly.
Right.
But they also...
So there's no disagreement with the protocols steering people off in the wrong direction. That's why people are getting frustrated with them.
The contention often comes around scale, and where if you put a 2 by 2 metre plot on top of a rush, you go, hey, we've got a wetland here. It's obviously inappropriate, right?
Yeah.
But what you can do is, and what you should do, is look at the wider context and the scale of what's occurring. There is some judgment with that, obviously, and that was what was talked about in quite some length in Dr. Keesing's evidence, and then also in the hearing. He referred to Tasman District Council's excerpt in the National Pasture Exclusion Method, which talks about mapping mosaics. In that instance there, they look at, in these types of degraded environments, is it 20 metres squared? That was that Jerome Lurie. I used to work with Jerome. That's what he said there, how they did it for them there. I've seen, so Greater Wellington Regional Council, they looked at put a plot on top of a rush. That was what they said, and it was like, oof. So, but what I want to make it clear here is that these are definitely wetlands. These aren't just marginal here or there or very small areas of rushes. So in this first one, figure 1314, this was the first wetland I looked at.
Page 22?
Page 22, yeah. And you'll see in the pages beforehand, so I did a plot, not to say, hey, look, if you put a plot down, this is wetland or whatever, picking one selection rushes. I just did it to ensure that I was consistent with the protocols, that that I had objective data to demonstrate that these areas were dominated by wetland vegetation. Walking around the area, there was all the hydrologic conditions that you would expect from a wetland, areas where water had been pooling for time. There were obligate wetland species in plate 13. There's soft mud through here.
So this is in the
Is the obligate the locus?
Obligate in this one was Isolepis prolifera. There.
Where is it?
This is a fact W1. It's a fact wetland. So this is in the northeastern corner of the site, next to Whare as it comes across into the site. That's where.
Oh, so that's the tramway there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, by there. And so to be thorough and ensure that I had objective data to support what I'm saying, I took soil core. Soil core was saturated. The soils in it were hydric soils. There was high amounts of organic material that wasn't being broken down because of anaerobic conditions. Shortly after taking my soil core, you could see the groundwater in there, and it was about 25 centimetres at that point.
So these are plates 14 and 15?
Yeah, 4 and 15, measured the groundwater there. You can identify it from aerial photographs there. And so that's what I had done. You can see it in the March 2023 photograph. The October one, you can still see, what can you see in there? You can see that it's been changed, it's been cleared since March, but that there's still hydrologic conditions under that are consistent with wetlands. My site visit was.
I don't think we dispute that there are wet areas with potentially, certainly facultative species, but probably obligates throughout the farm. The experience I had is that, just to explain it, is that the case that I was involved in, the regional council with its 2 metre plots, went on to what is clearly an historical bog. And it's more boggy than this. And you would swear to look at it at an angle, because this is how these Yunca species distort your vision, that you were essentially looking at a current unmodified bog. And the council having, the district council having consented a subdivision in that area, the regional council then issued abatement notices against all the new residents to stop them building their houses, which ultimately ended up with the council having to pay several $1 million losses associated with that. But that case turned on the question, does the pasture exclusion apply?
So that I'm familiar with the case.
Yeah.
Catherine Mansfield Drive.
Yeah.
And that was before the changes had been made in the NPSF. So that what is pasture and what is not pasture was different then to what it is now.
Right.
Since
and so
that
how
time,
has it changed?
the definition has changed.
From what to what?
Now the definition includes that is it dominated greater than 50% of species listed in the National Pasture Exclusion.
Yeah.
So now there's a distinct number of species.
Yeah.
Yep. And then there's also further guidance around how to determine that process.
Right.
So with that information, it could be such that that decision would be different now, but I don't know the details of.
I would have thought that the purpose of the change was to ensure that pasture was not caught.
Yes.
Rather, in other words, to wind back the reach of the protocol of the law, then to enlarge it.
I think the purpose of it was to provide greater clarity of what is and what is not a wetland.
Yeah.
That was the purpose of it.
Yeah.
There was dispute what is pasture and what is not pasture. And
Yeah.
that's why that species list was produced.
Yeah.
So when you look at these areas,
Yeah.
they are not dominated by pasture.
No, but the question again is, what's the area?
Well, one of them is 1,400 square meters. The other one's 1,500 square meters. And I show another one that's over half a hectare. These aren't tiny patches of rushes as suggested by Dr. Keesling.
Right. So you're saying they're bigger areas
Absolutely.
of non-pasture.
They're not, they're not dominated by, they weren't when I was there. Absolutely not.
So you've got the plots that transect that go out, show.
I didn't do transects through these areas. I did individual plots in these areas that show that, but I didn't need to do a full transect in these areas because as you can see from my photographs, these aren't pasture.
Well, I can't see it.
Can't you? Okay, all right. Well, can you see from the aerial photo, figure 13? Now the dark stuff is not pasture.
Figure 13.
So when you're making that decision on the 50%, where do you look at it? Is it paddock scale, site scale, or just within the area that you've identified as being wet?
So you're looking at, when you have a mosaic, you do a transect through that mosaic.
Right.
And then you do plots along that transect.
And so the mosaic, you're talking about, say, in figure 11 there, you've got a yellow line around it.
Or figure Yep, you can see it,
Yeah,
and that's pretty clear that.
So that's what you're referring to as a mosaic. So you draw a line on that and then say, is there 50% pasture species in there or not?
You could do a transect through there. You wouldn't need to do a transect through that one there because it clearly makes the rapid test, and you can see clearly that it wasn't dominated by pasture. There was no pasture, and there was patches of small bits in the interstitial spaces in there, but you can clearly see from that aerial photograph in the area that I've mapped there that that's not 50% pasture. You can also see it.
Well, that's a little bit tricky to make those visual observations, but figure 14 tends to look like it's dominated by pasture.
Which one, sorry?
Figure 14.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does look like that there. But let's remember that natural land wetlands is from 2020, isn't it? That's when the definition came in.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Your point being?
That these are natural inland wetlands that occurred after the NPSFM was introduced.
Yeah, I'm just saying the pasture exclusion test would probably apply to figure 14.
Could do, but remember, my site survey was in November 2023, slightly after that had been cleared. I'm struggling to understand. So I'm not sure. So what happens when, so you talk about normal circumstances being present when, and this is what the protocols require. So if there's been recent vegetation clearance, let's say a landowner goes in and clears a wetland, and then you send your ecologist out and you say, there's no wetland here, that doesn't prevent it from being a wetland. What the protocols require is that you then need to look at recent aerial photographs. And when that's unclear, you look at the soils as well. And so in this instance, what I've done is there was recent vegetation clearance. I looked at the aerial photograph. From the aerial photograph, I could see that it was a wetland. I looked at the soils, they were consistent with wetland soils. I looked at the hydrology, groundwater was within 30 centimetres, or the growing area of all these plants. And from those observations, it was clear that under the definition of a natural inland wetland or a wetland under the RMA, that this was consistent with those definitions. Now, my scope was not to go out and map every wetland on this site. I was engaged to see whether the values that Dr. Keesing had described in his report were accurate. And in doing this, I did 2 thorough investigations where it was clear that there were natural inland wetlands and provide the data for that. I didn't do it for the whole site, but I want to show you figure 17. So those were the areas that I mapped before going to site to give me an understanding of where should I have a look where there could be natural inland wetlands. And that was based on looking at aerial photographs that consistently showed where there was water or there was a change in vegetation type. Then figure 18, you'll see there's far less of those areas there, but that was based on a more recent aerial photograph. If you look at the aerial photograph from 1981 that we were looking at earlier, you can see that these wetlands are still present there. And they're entirely consistent with what you'd expect from the wider landscape. They're dune slack wetlands. They're not dominated by pasture.
So those 2 figures, you haven't done a rapid test, you're just looking at what's...
No, I've just looked at aerial photographs and seen where there's consistent pooled water within areas and done coarse mapping of those and gone, yeah, that looks like there was a wetland there, there was a wetland there, there was a wetland.
Okay, in figures 15 and 16, did you do a rapid test for those, for that location?
No, I found that one there spoke for itself. So I zoomed in on that area when I was looking at those other 2 and I saw that and went, oh man, that's clear as day as a wetland. And I looked at an older photograph as well, which showed that it was a wetland as well. But what's really apparent in there is you can see how wet it is, consistently wet in the October photograph as well as the March one. You know, just because the vegetation's been cleared, you have to use your professional judgment at that point. But that doesn't stop it from being a natural inland wetland as per the definition and the protocols.
So with the absence of the vegetation, it doesn't stop it?
No, you need to use recent aerial photographs. That's what the protocol says.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in figure 16, it looks like it's been cleared. So that's still a natural inland wetland despite it not having the wetland vegetation.
Yes.
Okay. Does it come back after it's been cleared like that or not?
Yes.
It does.
Yeah, you have to do a really good job of draining it. That's what you're seeing in figure 15. So if you look at it previous years before that, it's likely that some of those areas may have been drained and impact, cleared, but then because they have that natural dune slack hydrology, the wetlands just keep coming back in these areas.
So like a seed source in there or?
It's just where the hydrology is.
Yeah.
And so what's important, Dr. Keesing said that these have no value, these areas. Maybe true. It's not. Birds feed in them. In fact, white heron was found in some of these areas, feeding in these areas. But what the NPSFM requires is that you have to assess potential value. Not the current value, their potential value. And when you do that, dune slack wetlands are a threatened ecosystem type. They're naturally uncommon because they live in, they're formed in dune areas. So that needs to be taken into account when assessing potential value. Then you have to make assumptions and look at, what could this be? And if we look at, I understand the current laws require wetlands over 500 square metres to be fenced. So if that was applied on these areas here, and given that they are in close proximity to nicer wetlands that provide a seed source for all those other good plants, with time, these would just regenerate back into nice, indigenous dominated wetland. Fence them off and leave them alone, and then that's the potential value that needs to be assessed. Cumulative effects also need to be assessed. Neither of those have been considered as part of the application.
So
In fact,
who says they should be fenced on?
The stock regulations, but I'm unsure if the government's changed those before this hearing or not. I don't know where it's at, but my understanding was lowland environments require wetlands over 500 metres squared to have wetlands fenced by July 2025.
Okay.
They may have changed that.
Sure of that.
Irrespective of that, the potential value of these needs to be considered. And they need to be considered at all. They haven't been considered as part of this application. Wetlands haven't been considered. The effects to wetlands haven't been considered at all.
And so in terms of the potential value, you've got the floral component and you've got your fauna component. So the potential habitat for birds like white heron, and I have seen them actually on a similar site. And in terms of vegetation, what significance?
Very low.
Very low?
Yeah, these are highly modified wetland, absolutely.
So there are only real significances in terms of being a habitat for significant.
Their significance, well, depends how you want to break it down. But their significance is really driven by their natural uncommon of this type of wetland. And it really comes down to things like the makeup of the soil, again, the abiotic factors in these areas, the salinity and what composition of plants that will produce in these areas. So that's where their real value lies. And there's
So there's
quite a lot of them as well. So
Yeah.
cumulatively, it's hectares of wetland.
So their significance is driven by the natural uncommonness of the soils.
Yeah.
But they don't have very significant flora.
No.
Or likely to, in terms of looking at potential, as you said before.
If you were required to fence off the wetlands over 500 metres squared,
Yeah.
and then you left natural processes to do what they do, and then depending on what do we talk, timescale is the hard one. Like if we were looking at the duration of the consent, at 16 years, their value would go up immensely over a 16-year period. That exercise is, I don't know, it's quite a difficult one.
Mm. And in terms of the avifauna, fauna, how significant would they be? Okay, so we've got white heron potentially feeding in these locations.
Not at all. They're
Not also good.
no, I don't think
No.
that negligible significance for avifauna, because there's a lot of habitat for them in the surrounding area. They don't hold special or unique habitats for avifauna like Te Whare Whare.
Yeah.
But I have seen small wetlands, probably the size of this, array of tables here. Raupo had colonised in it. This was in an airport, so very, very modified spatial environment, and it held vertebrate in those areas, which is an at-risk species. Small wetlands can have fauna values, really high fauna values.
Yeah, I don't think there is a stock exclusion provision for that.
For 500 metre squares anymore. Has that law changed? Has it?
I'm not sure whether it's changed, but it's not in there at the moment.
Yeah, it got removed and sort of for those slope.
Oh, yes. Okay, there you go.
So the capacity cumulative effects assessment that, and you're talking about in terms of values, is a prospective, that's other words saying this has the capacity to return and provide environmental services, ecological services. But based on its present values, other than the odd bird feeding off it, and recognising that those values would change depending on farming management practices.
I'm probably going to stop you here and say that the values of these wetlands haven't been assessed. We don't know what the values are. I don't know if there's a rare plant that has been able to persist in this environment, given that they have unique abiotic conditions in here, in dunes lake wetlands. It can't be completely discounted that a small little threatened herb lives in one of these many hectares of area. I don't know, and I can't say otherwise. What I can say is that they haven't been assessed by the applicant, and the level of redress from the constructed wetlands, it's just unknown. So as part of my Section 92 report, simply said, follow the MFE protocols, assess the wetlands, and I didn't get any objective data back. I was told it was all pasture, and still it's where we're at now. So the first exercise that needs to go on is somebody to go out, follow the MFE protocols as they are, whether they agree with them or not. Go through the process, doesn't meet this definition. Then from there, we can understand whether the level of effects are appropriate, work through this process. But that hasn't occurred. So I don't know how to approach effects management for something that hasn't been assessed.
The wetlands and the forest remnants, they weren't significant.
Yeah, I think
I should say the wet areas.
they are a higher value. Yep, absolutely. Significant, right. I would need to assess it against the significance criteria, and I assume that I haven't done I haven't done an assessment of it, so I can't say otherwise, but there are patches of Kahikatea swamp forest on this site.
And is that, I can't see your face.
Within the proposed mining footprint, but that's disputed between Dr. Keesing and I, whether these are actual Kahikatea swamp forest. But in my opinion, absolutely. And again, it's in my section 92 report, you can see partially drained old Kahikatea swamp forest. The thing is with Kahikatea forest, you get these stands of it where it's pure Kahikatea, where it's swamp forest. These areas of pure stands of Kahikatea are within these dune slats. There's water all around them. I plugged a soil core through there, all wetland soils, and then there was isolepis growing around the base of them. It's old Kahikatea swamp forest, highly degraded. Absolutely, it's been blanched up by stock, but it's still Kahikatea swamp forest. Little patches of it. And Forest B, did you notice the water pouring out of the ground in that one when you walked through it?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. That's a wetland. That area.
What I observed was water discharging from the elevated levels of the dune into the watercourse, into the drain, and then going out. Where that came from, I have no idea, because it was the only time I saw it.
Yeah, I'm not a hydrologist. I just for transparency, I have worked and done hydrology work for a couple of years, but I'm not a hydrologist. But I don't know whether there are preferential pathways with two whare that link these, or if there's a perched wetlands. But yeah, it is concerning that where this water is coming from and the amount of water and the proximity to two whare at a very, I'm not, again, not as a hydrologist, but it is concerning that there could be links to this area here, and given you're going to dig a big hole, that risks to dewatering. But I understand the hydrologists have looked at that and they are confident that that won't occur.
So turning to figure 17 for a minute.
Yes.
So am I correct in understanding what you're suggesting is that there's a need for 10-metre buffer from all of those fragments?
Why a 10-metre buffer from this fragment?
Well, that's the question I'm asking. So what are you suggesting? If these are the wetlands you believe are present at the site,
Yeah.
what are you recommending to us in terms of management of those fragments?
Well, to be consistent with the MPSFF, there would need to be, I understand, a functional need to do this work in a wetland.
Right.
So that would be the first test.
But what you're saying is actually they need to be identified properly or surveyed properly first, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you follow the.
And then obviously whatever consent requirements would come out of that.
Yes.
Or consent pathway.
Yeah. What will be difficult is because of the management that has occurred is teasing out where natural and land wetland actually is versus the pasture as it stands in its current form now. And what the risk is that recent works that have caused wetlands to be further drained and cleared may result in wetlands not being identified that were natural inland wetlands when the EPSFM was introduced in 2020.
So you're saying that there's been changes since that MPS came in to try and change the water management of this area specifically to avoid those natural inland wetlands continuing.
That's what aerial photographs show. The aerial photographs that I had seen, whether that was intentional or not, I can't talk to that. But what I can see is that there was a figure 13, quite clearly a natural inland wetland. Figure 14, that natural inland wetland was, vegetation was cleared within that natural inland wetland. And then I was asked to come out to site in November 2023. I also note that when I did my site visit, it took a while because the West Coast is obviously quite a wet place. So I specifically requested to give some time between the last bit of rain and coming out to site. So it hadn't rained for 5 days before I came out to site to ensure that I wasn't inadvertently misled by recent rain as part of my assessment.
Based on based on what you see here, do you think, I mean, a lot of the West Coast lowland sand dunes would be classified as natural inland wetlands?
The low-lying areas within them,
Yeah,
likely to be, yeah.
most.
It's all over the country. It's not
Yeah.
to the West Coast, yeah.
What about the hump and hollow scenario? Most of the hollows, would they meet those classifications?
Those would be an artificial watercourse.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, because it's been specifically created.
Exactly, so it wouldn't meet that definition.
Is there swamp forest, Kakatea swamp forest in the scenic reserve?
Would it
It's definitely around the lake. Of the lake.
Yeah. I suspect I do, but I'm too too exhausted. To go further. So are these wetlands, as far as you can tell, mosaic types?
They will likely be in their current form now. Yeah, there'll be patches of pasture and there'll be patches of wetland. So, yeah, that's what I'd expect. I mean, you'd need to do a mapping exercise to a mosaic mapping exercises where there are changes of pasture and wetland dominant species in estuarine hollows. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't think I can think of anything other usefully to ask you.
No, I'm good. Thank you very much for your answers.
Yeah,
Good effort.
thank you. Is there anything that you felt you wanted to cover off additionally that we didn't?
I think just again in this last response that I provide, now Dr. Keesing talks about the effects management approach for this project making good ecological sense. And I took that on board and thought, well, what do I think makes good ecological sense, and what is more consistent, or what is consistent in my view with what's needed for effects management and applying avoid, minimise, remedy. And in my opinion, forest A and B meet the significance criteria, and therefore direction is that they should be avoided. I don't believe the other forest fragments meet the significance criteria, and if they were to be cleared, what would make good ecological sense is using the residual effects of indigenous vegetation clearance for those other hectare or so of bushes, to use that as planting to help protect further those two remnants. So fencing off them and planting up in there to make a more contiguous thick piece of forest that connects the Mahinapua Scenic Reserve to the two whare riparian margin. And I show that in figure 19. I think that would make sense to me and would be consistent with the effects management hierarchy.
So let me just have a look at that. So what's figure 19 showing us?
So that green area there, that should be a priority for remediation planting.
Okay, so you're saying leave those forest A and B, plant around it, let us a buffer, fill that area.
That would make better sense to do that ecologically, because what it does is that it protects significant forest values on site, and then it also creates a larger, more contiguous and better connection between the two whare riparian margin and Mahinapua Scenic Reserve. And that follows good ecological principles.
Anything else? Okay. So it's almost 4 o'clock. I think we're probably going to have Mr. Robertson next after a short break, and then I don't think we're really in a position to hear the planning evidence today, if you don't mind. And then what's the plan for the reply?
I'll have a chat tonight, but I was thinking that I would try and prepare something to speak to tomorrow.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the plan of attack. So we'll have 5-minute break and then we'll come to you. Supplementary statement.
I'm quite happy to take your direction about how you would like to proceed.
Yeah, I've lost my direction, but I think if you just take us through your, I mean, there's a little bit where you've borrowed or appropriated work of Mr. Payne, which I don't think we need to go over again. But it seems to me that your supplementary statement discusses two things, perceptual effects and the wider physical effects, landscape effects. Is that the sort of broad categorization or not? What's the difference between, what's the primary difference between you and Ms. Crawford?
That's a great question. I say in my supplementary, I think the reality is we've both been very clear about how we've relied on our ecology experts in the physical space. So I think I share your view. We can probably just leave that where it is.
Yeah.
For the moment.
But what's the significance that you attach to ecology, both attach to ecology in terms of effects on landscape?
So naturalness effectively, but also I think from my perspective, the implication of removal of the bush remnants in particular on the perceptual values. And the very simple way to think about that is that if we remove the remnants along that boundary, we're effectively dropping what I call the middle ground skyline. And when you go and put a 17-metre tall building there, you're actually increasing potentially the prominence of that. So both Ms. Crawford and I are saying that from a physical perspective, in terms of outstandingness and natural character and those sorts of things, we're reliant on the ecologists. Where I have picked up a physical aspect that perhaps she has not, is around the modification to landform, so the loss of the dune landform as a dune landform. The proposed plan for the site is that it basically becomes a homogeneous single slope from east to west. Now, the effort that I went into in my supplementary evidence was to try and the table at the very end of paragraph 64 effectively says, this is a position from my original statement of evidence, where it relies on Mr. Payne in the physical sense, and where I drew conclusions primarily around the perceptual. I've tried to entertain, because there has been some commentary around the permitted baseline or the working environment and what might be reasonably expected. And then an effort in my revised position is to say, okay, well, if we explore that a bit as it relates to both physical and perceptual, because associative, I don't think is a substantive issue for us in this case. This is what the implications. So in the case, if you look at that table, effectively what I'm saying is that in the physical sense, again, relying on Mr. Payne and his evidence, if we were to accept, so in the temporary setting, there's an agreement between the landscape architects that landform modification, I believe, will have a moderate degree of effect. So in the temporary setting, my effects don't change. Right? The little back bracket in that says low is if you prefer the evidence of Mr. Keesing over Mr. Payne, and that basically takes that whole dialogue from a physical aspect of landscape out. So
I don't I understand what you're saying. That's quite a helpful diagram or table. Sorry, what was your question?
That's right, I was just asking, who's found it?
I don't understand how a landscape effect goes from high to low, turning on the question of significance of a piece of land, piece of vegetation that's buffered by highly degraded forest, but has a core or some element of it which is highly, according to Mr. Payne, typical characteristic, moderately similar composition. How does that affect your physical assessment in such a dramatic way?
No, the low is if you accept the position of Mr. Keating, which is quite different to the position around the significance and the effects of removing that vegetation on the biophysical aspects of landscape. So that in the brackets is if you were to disregard Mr. Payne's, and my reliance, of course, on Mr. Payne's evidence and accept the ecological evidence of Mr. Keating, which the applicant's landscape architect has done, then it stands to reason that we get closer together.
So you're saying the biophysical landscape change has a high degree of similarity to the significance attached to the ecological level?
Predominantly, yes. And
Isn't that normal? It is some naturalness, I suppose, but and all those science factors and all those sorts of things, but yeah, anyway,
I think the difference in opinion between the two landscape architects is actually around the perceptual effects of the proposal.
yeah.
And it still goes back to my way of thinking, it still goes back to those two core aspects. The processing area and predominantly the WCP, the processing plant, and the experience of the Mahina walkway. To me, those are the two substantive differences of opinion between the landscape architects.
So can we talk about the visibility of the processing plant? Because it's not clear to me through the applicant's cross-section. It shows, you know, a cross-section through the dune and through the bund and won't be visible, but she said that it'll be visible from further down the road when you're approaching the site. But I don't understand how visible it'll be. So can you describe how visible it will be?
I can certainly try. Yes, I have an opinion on that. And I think so. So the way that I've tried to figure it out on site with try and find things in the landscape, obviously there's nothing of this nature.
Yeah.
That are similar size and scale. So if you go down to the southern end of the site, you'll see a bush ring in there. It's a similar distance away from the state. It's right down next to the Mahina Scenic Reserve. It's about 150 metres away from the road, so it's a similar separation distance. It's about the same height in terms of the vegetation that's in there. There might be a metre or two's difference either way. And in terms of footprint, it's pretty similar to the WCP as well. So if you look at that element and think, okay, well, I'll just pick that up there, or take the image that we've been given by the applicant and put it to the location that it's proposed, you will see this plant pretty much from the entire road frontage of the site proper. So as soon as if you're heading north, as soon as you pop out from behind the Mahina Scenic Reserve, which on that side is on your right-hand side, you will get a gun barrel view of the plant. It will be above the skyline. And similarly, coming from the other direction, which is the dwelling or the access to the Mahina track, you will get a similar, I term a gun barrel view, or an acute angle towards the plant that is likely to be above the backdrop of the Mahina scenic area. And obviously, as you approach either direction and get closer, its prominence grows.
Right, so it's going to be changing all the time as you move.
Yes.
And at its worst, how high would it appear above the bund?
Well, I think it's going to be, the bund's 3 metres, so I think it's going to be at least 10 to 12 metres above the bund. And I think the cross-section from the state highway, which I commented in my original evidence, is probably what you're going to see when you're right angles to the plant. Now, I accept that for a road user, that's going to be, you know, that's not going to be your predominant view.
Yeah.
But certainly for the property across the road, that's going to be the outlook that you get.
And would it help us to understand the visibility of the plant by having a different way of showing this on the paper?
A visual simulation would have been more helpful. But I think and I'm hypothesising here, that one of the comments that I made in my original review was that the height of the plant seemed to be a few metres lower than what 17 metres when you scale it off the plan. And I just assumed that might have been done to at least introduce a little bit of how perspective or depth of view might have impacted its height above the bund. But I can't say that that was the case or not, and there's been no response to that particular point in evidence. So certainly I think that a visual simulation that modelled the plant from the approach rather than directly beside would have been a lot more helpful. But in my view, you are going to see over the top of the bund, particularly when you've got a bit of depth of view, you are going to see the majority of the processing plant. And between the period of the time where the bunds are formed and the planting actually grows, several meters, you're going to see the majority of the processing plant as well, workshops and things like that.
So it will be visible. What impact is it going to have in terms of people's experience going down that highway?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely going to impact on. I've canvassed in my evidence that the impact on the openness or the scenic values of that rural landscape, that local landscape. At the moment, when you drive, if you just take southbound, you're coming from Hokitika, it's a relatively constrained view on your inland side. And you come past Te Wharewhare, and there's the historic overbridge there. You pop up onto the flats, and it starts to get quite interesting. You feel the view opens up. You get a little bit of a view going past the golf course to the coastal side, and then once you get to the edge of the site, the view to the west opens up. And I think that still is the predominant experience for the road user in that location. That's certainly the first impression that I got when I drove past the site heading into the Mahinapua Scenic Reserve was, that's pretty impressive. I can see right across that landscape, there's virtually no built form there other than low-level houses and the dwellings that are actually on the farm, all very low in the view, and there's nothing interrupting that scenic view to the sea. And so it helps, obviously, on a reasonable day.
But when someone's going down there, they'll all be experiencing the infrastructure of the road itself, the power lines, houses, sheds, that type of stuff. How will they, I suppose, will that mitigate that impact of the plant? Will it make it more contextually consistent than non-consistent?
I don't think it will, because the plant is so different. It's going to be so atypical, firstly in terms of height. I mean, we're talking 4 to 5 stories, depending on how you measure a story, 3.5 meters generally for a building, so 4 and a bit stories. The appearance of it is unlike anything in that particular setting. If you're thinking about that driving experience from Hokitika down to Mahinapua, it's all residential rural dwellings and farm sheds and homogeneous cladding and things that you would expect in a rural environment, reasonably expect in a rural environment. So I think this is going to be more prominent, and the other aspects is that it does stand quite proud of all of the elements in a landscape that we would normally talk about that reduced visual prominence. So, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to visit 9 Mile, but I did see the photos that were taken on a site visit. I actually think it shows, when you are a little bit elevated, or you've got a structure that, arguably is out of place in a rural environment, when it is below skylines and when it has got land backdrop and all of those sorts of things, visual prominence does reduce. In that case, I was looking at photos 300 odd meters away from the plant, but you can just see that when you have those sorts of conditions, which we don't here, we have a plant that is relatively close to the state highway and some dwellings. We have it taller than virtually any other element in the landscape, certainly another built element. It looks completely different than any other rural element in this particular, or typical rural elements in this landscape. And so I think it will have the effect of leading the eye and people going, what on earth is that? Which is when you start to get people reacting to rural character or scenic values and things like that, it will definitely impact openness. I don't think you can reasonably argue that when you are trucking along the state highway or you're on the adjoining rural property that you won't see this thing, and that it will change the general appearance of the local rural landscape, that it is generally atypical in terms of buildings that we would anticipate in a rural environment.
And how much how much weighting would you put on the fact that Ms Crawford said the sides of the plant are not solid like a normal building, it's open, and she suggested that as a way that it sort of mitigates its own impact a little bit. How much weighting would you put on?
Oh, I don't put much weight on that because I don't think it is open. You look at the photos that have been provided. Yes, there's some visual permeability in certain aspects, but fundamentally there's still a building that is going to block your view.
And what about the proposed paint scheme? I think I think it might be like a green on the bottom and a white on top. What sort of mitigations that?
Yeah, well, the difficulty with split paint schemes is depends on where you're viewing it from, right? So I don't get me wrong, I understand the theory behind it. Interestingly, Ms Crawford mentioned a car park at the Wellington Airport, and when she spoke to you the other day, I was actually involved in the design of that building, and peer reviewed the landscape assessment when I was at PECA for that consent. That wasn't primarily a visual mitigation tool. That was a way of providing some sort of graphical representation of the local landscape on a really big building. So there is difficulty, and it used to happen early wind turbines. There's a wind farm heading over to Tora in the Ruatapu that had split colours. And so the bottom half is, I don't know how many metres of the turbine is green, and then the top half is jumbo grey was the rage. And that's not very effective at all because it depends on where you're driving. You know, it's good here, then you go around the corner and it's dark green.
Yeah, so my interest is in perceptual values. Is that essentially your assessment of the incongruity of this element in the landscape?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment.
And if in a community, for example, they did studies on wind farms, and they said, if the wind farm was owned by the community, perceptual value was X. And if it wasn't owned, it was imposed on the community, it was X times 100%. So it was a order of magnitude difference. And so some people who are in favour of mining say, I see that and I see something that is very positive. And another person says, I hate mining, so they see it as very negative. And my question is, how much does that incongruity, in a sense, dependent on the recipient population's view of the activity?
I think it is definitely a factor. It's a difficult thing to pull into specialist technical assessment in the absence of that information. In an ideal world, you go out and do a community survey.
Well, isn't the district plan a proxy for that in terms of how it views mining? The sense that it's the community's views about, if they say, if you say, I'm going to encourage wind farms in the district because we think it's a positive contribution to a social good. Isn't that in a sense something that you can draw views about in terms of landscape impact?
Well, I think you'd have to balance that with the other matters or the other cues, I guess, that the plan is also talking about. I think that you have to accept that in any proposal, there'll be differing views on what good and what bad is generally.
Oh yeah, I appreciate that, but I'm just saying that if one finds in the district plan perceptions about mining as an activity that is positive, aren't you able to then draw the same point that means the population to some extent accepts the consequences of enabling that mining? In other words, there is a coherence there between the planning and the ultimate assessment. We can't disconnect the two. The district plan provides some information about the perceptions the community carries, which you accept it does affect perceptual values.
I don't know if that can, I don't know if that means that, well, I guess what I'm trying to reconcile is, does that mean that the effects of this particular element of the proposal somehow become okay?
Well,
Is that
well, I'm not really saying, well, I could then lead into another point, which is in Hokitika, you've got this humongous dairy factory immediately adjacent to a residential area. It, to my mind, looks like a very incongruous element to find in a residential location. But in a rural community which values rural production and sees rural production as intrinsic to its community effort, this has happened as a natural evolution, and the community seem to, you know, it's been around, it's happened, it's organically grown over time, and it's developed. And I just wonder whether the West Coast community would say, if they saw a processing plant for a mining activity on the road, goodness me, that's not what I'd expect in West Coast. You know what I mean? It's like, how much are we actually assessing the man or woman in the streets' likely reaction to the presence of this?
Yeah, I have to admit, I have trouble with the parallels being drawn between the Westland Dairy Factory, because my understanding is that's an industrial zone, or at least it's a bespoke zone for the purposes of the factory. It's not a rural zone. So I struggle with the comparison between an element that's been standing in the what I describe as an urban landscape, if we could,
Yeah,
because it's Hokitika. That may or may not have preceded residential areas, and it was there first. Basically,
probably was.
Probably, well, it's been there a long time.
Yeah.
Versus something that is in a rural environment, where I think the expectations of adjoining land uses, I don't think that I'm struggling with the comparison, if I'm being really honest.
Yeah, well, maybe it's a poor comparison. I'm happy for you to say that, but I guess the point I'm not wanting to do is to ascribe a level of perceptual effect that, in a sense, is not one that can be properly ascribed to the community.
Well, I think the difficulty is lumping the community under one banner, and for some people that work at the mine, it's going to be an absolute non-issue.
Mm.
For some people that work in mining more broadly, then I think their sensitivity will be lower.
Mm.
I think for people that live in that rural landscape, with that has the values that have been identified, I think it's going to be a big problem. I think there will be a higher degree of effect. I think some of the submissions certainly indicate that. And what I've done is I've applied my professional judgment to a situation. And look, as an example, I was involved in the plan change, 30-year plan change for the Sinlay Dairy Factory. So that's a big dairy factory located right next to State Highway 6. But the receiving environment at that stage was completely different to this one. the characteristics of the local landscape. It already had a Transpower substation, it already had a railway line, it already had dryer towers, dry stores and things like that. So when we were considering our affairs, which the remaining part of the site was rurally zoned, there were no policies like we've got around scenic values or continuity of the mountains, the policies that we've been talking about, the character of the rural environment, the quality of the rural environment, the level of expectation that people moving past the site had for what was being proposed was completely different. And I think the one of the issues that we have here, and what I've tried to capture in my subsequent assessment, is that we don't really have any, I think, the precedent for something like this in this particular local landscape. In a landscape that is characterised by openness and a lack of, built forms, certainly of this appearance, certainly of this scale and location to receptors, in one that has open views right across not just the site, the rural site, but to the Mahinapua area, the wider lake area, into the Southern Alps beyond. I think that there is a level of effect that is quite high. And I think a big factor in that is the nighttime component to it. So there's daytime component, but I think there is still a significant issue. And I was out there last night for probably 45 minutes, sitting by the Mahinapua, driving the highway, but also sitting by the Mahinapua Scenic Reserve and sitting in people's driveways. And it was a beautiful moonlit night. I could make out the Southern Alps. There's a very low lighting scenario. All of the residential buildings, as you're travelling south or northbound, doesn't really matter. You don't really see them until you're upon them. And this element is going to be quite stark in its comparison to those. It is going to stand out, or at least I don't think there's enough analysis that's been done or enough confidence in the nighttime environment that it is not going to be highly visible. And people that do surround the site and people that are driving along the state highway, it's going to affect their perception of that nighttime environment. And again, of those people that have submitted on the proposal, several have raised that very issue. It's going to be taller than the backdrop vegetation. It's going to have lighting to approximately 15 metres high by my measurement, based on where the spotlights, it's probably not the right term, but the lights are located on the processing plant.
And so there's going to be a 12-metre bund. Is there going to be a bund in front of it or not? No.
3-metre bund.
3-metre bund.
3-metre bund. And the other aspect, of course, is that you haven't got just the plant sitting in isolation to itself. You've got the movement of machinery at night time. So my assessment is not just a daytime assessment. It's in relation to what's been proposed. And in my assessment, a high degree or moderate high degree of perceptual effect.
So with the nighttime lighting, the applicant is proposing to use lighting, it's got a lighting mitigation plan in relation to birds. Will that help reduce the impact on that?
Well, it is better than no lighting plan at all. The issue that I have with lighting is that lux is used as a measure for compliance. Now, the problem with the lux is measured at a boundary or usually a residential location. And that's really about light spill. So if I've got a light source over there, am I likely to get that spill to where I'm standing? And from a visibility point of view, lux isn't actually the issue. It's actually the brightness of the source, which is more of a lumen issue. So you can have, and one thing that I discovered last night is if you go across the Hogan's Bridge at night, have a look across to your left and look at the catenary lights that are put onto the ship. I forget the name of the ship that's out, the Tamworth. And that scenario, you can see it from the bridge. That's over 1 kilometre away, and all that has is effectively LED fairy lights. It's got some low-level lighting in terms of uplights and blue lighting, but it's not hard to say, okay, well, we're not going to get those. And it is highly visible at night time. And I would argue not comparable, a lot less than what is likely to occur when you think about the lighting of the plant itself, the movement of machinery at night time, because you've still got diggers slewing and booms moving, you've got trucks arriving and things like that. So I think that is a big issue, and is one of the primary drivers around the level of effect that I have ascribed.
Back to the paint job. Is that going to be, like with the white on top, is that going to blend in? Because when I rode my bike down that highway, I could, the background is green and black. And it just struck me the white is going to be in contrast to that rather than, and I can understand having white when you're seeing it in the background of the sky maybe or clouds. What's your view on, whether that white, it's got a 65% reflectivity value is appropriate or not?
I'm mindful that it's not a particular condition that I took issue with when I prepared my evidence. One of the reasons for that was because I was proposing that the whole thing got lowered, so the issue becomes less. And I think even if I recall correctly, that we talked about inverting the split of so green was more low down and then white higher up. It was on a blue day, on a bluebell coast day like we've had in the next past couple of days, then it's probably not going to do a lot in terms of mitigating the effects. I still don't know how they're going to paint the WCP to get a split. I look at the photos that have been provided for the 9 Mile, and I don't know how that gets done practically unless you paint all the components in one hit. But to answer your question, no, I don't think it is a particularly effective design measure. I think you're better off to deal with the fundamental issue, which is the height of the plant.
And I think you mentioned the idea of having bunding closer to it and fast growing, conifers or something like that. Is that something that even if it can't be dropped, is that something that's got a prospect of working?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I'm from Canterbury. I drive past double rows of poplars in summer and in winter, even now, and they screen very, very effectively, and they grow a heck of a lot faster than what native plants do. Part of my suggestion, I think the other thing too that I was suggesting, planting around the plant, was also an alternative to planting of the bunds, which, as you're aware, I'm not a great fan of.
So on that, you're saying that that is affecting openness itself, with planted bunds.
Yeah, and I just believe that we're going to be a long way down the life of the mining process before that mitigation reaches a height that is actually making a demonstrable or lessening effects to a demonstrable degree. It's going to take a long time at agreed 0.45 metres a year. And again, this is an issue that I'm really familiar with because when we did the work for the Synlait dairy factory, we had exactly the same approach and passed it on. I was acting for Synlait, by the way. We had exactly the same approach imparted by the council's landscape architect. And in that case, we had 45 metre high dry towers, 15 metre high dry stores, and we had a 3 metre high bund with native plants along the crest of it. And that's been well over 10 years that's been growing, and it's only just started to screen the dry stores in front of it, which are comparable to this. So I just don't think it's a particularly effective approach. But the other aspect to was the openness aspect and perpetuity, which, was an issue that I raised, but one that I also accept based on shelter belt establishment along the boundary, whether or not I think that's going to be likely that the farmer will establish a 1.5 kilometre shelter belt along the western boundary. That if you accept that permitted baseline, then that issue goes away in terms of the impacts on the openness and the perpetuity. I think it would be better, instead of blocking the entire views and relying on slow growing natives, to accept that the plant is where it is, and to get some faster growing exotics around the perimeter of the plant, so it becomes an island rather than a wall. And remove it once you're done.
That will invariably mean the works on the site will be visible though, won't it? Because the plant will be screened, but the work site won't.
I think that some of the machinery operation, particularly when you get towards the processing plant, the first several years where the mining is happening on the eastern side of the site, I don't think that's generating a particularly high degree of potential effect. And the bund's still in as well. So the bund will do a job for views, particularly close-up views at ground level. And I don't think that for certainly for people going past on the state highway, I don't think seeing machinery over there well into the eastern side and the sort of the eastern half of the site is actually generating a significant degree of effect.
So you're saying there that you're happy with the bund when the machinery is close to the highway, but it should be gone when it's further away. Right.
Sorry, so my initial recommendation was that if we are able to delay the construction of the bund to maintain openness, that'd be great, because we're not actually reliant on it to mitigate the effects of the operation, the mining operation, when it's on the other side of the site. When it gets closer, and I think the last half of the mining operation, when you can actually discern what's going on, I think definitely the bund will have a role to play there. And arguably the vegetation would as well, if it's on the bund. I guess what I was suggesting is that if we can maintain the openness and we can achieve the screening of the plant in a different way, then that would be, I think that would be preferable. And the other aspect is that we've got along that the western boundary, the state highway boundary, we've got bund and planting, but we've also got sections that have no bund. So we're going to have sections where after 10 years, you've probably got maximum 4 metre high native planting. So admittedly, it's glimpses as you travel along the state highway, but it's not going to be very effective.
Is the openness of this landscape, is it some ways artificial? Because I mean, obviously, it used to be all forest.
Yep.
And now it's open and we can get nice views.
Yeah.
Yes, I suppose. Yeah, is that relevant in all this?
Well, and that's a characteristic of Westland. This constant open enclosure of moving through the landscape. So in a way, yes. Yes, it is a characteristic that has been created by historical land clearance, whatever that, whether it's been deforestation to start and then mining, or whether it's been rural practices. The site is reflective of that journey pretty much all the way down Westland, where you have got dense native bush right up to the roadway, punctuated usually around things like rivers and road injunctions and things like that, where it opens out into exactly what we've got. What's a little bit unique about this one is that not all of those have, really special qualities and experiential qualities that wrap around them. You have walkways and ONLs and ONFs under the proposed plan, and clear views to the Southern Alps.
The ONLs being around Mananui Reserve.
Only.
ONL has been around the Mananui Reserve.
What sort of how's it significant in landscape terms of the bunds? Sorry, the dunes.
I don't think. Well, I think they're a notable element of the landscape. I think they are a reflection of. It's a little bit like the conversation that you have with this pain around the geology or the soil qualities. I don't think it's significant, but it is definitely a defining characteristic. It's been altered though, not so much on this site, but when you look at the opposing site, you can see where the humping and hollowing and bits and pieces have happened.
It's just a question, the plant's pushed quite to the south of the site, away from northern lines. So I accept that when you're coming from north, you'll have quite reasonable views as you approach the plant and then pass it. Coming from the south, you've got that dense part of the bush.
Scenic reserve.
Yes. Will there be more fleeting views? Because you'll literally pass the bush, see the plant, and then you'll pass it.
I don't think that I don't think that the degree of the plant, visible duration amount will be any different from north to south. I think what is a little bit different is the nature of the view.
Right.
So I do think that the nature of the backdrop when you're heading south towards the Southern Alps, towards the Hokitika Gorge, is different than when you're heading north. You don't tend to get that same sense of being on the coast. The scenic values.
Does its context, its location and proximity to Hokitika make any difference in that? You know, when we arrive in these rural provincial towns, there's often a sort of a lead up to them in terms of built forms gradually increasing. Does that make any difference?
I don't think so. I think I hear what you're saying. I think what we're talking about here is the characteristics of this local landscape.
A lot of questions.
Many questions. Well, okay. I think we understand. So the summary is ecology aside, which is physical changes. Your assessment is that the perceptual values during the course of the mining operation have major effects or significant effects on the experience of the walkway and also for residents and areas in that location because of the incongruous element of the processing plant.
I think the effects on the walkway are more aligned with the mining activity proximate to the walkway than the plant itself. Obviously, it's still going to be visible, but for me, it's about the mining operation proximate to the northern boundary that creates the effects on the walkway users, as distinct from the other receptors being more affected by the plant itself, the processing plant and the WCP.
And how are perceptual values different from experiential values?
Well, experiential values are part of, without getting into the nitty-gritty. So experiential values, you obviously have to be in the landscape to experience them.
Which is what most people will be in. The people who live there and the people who walk there.
Yeah. The broader concept of perception is it takes into things like cognitive responses to landscapes. Now, that sound at this time of the day, that's probably not helpful. The way that people wayfind, the way that people that organise their journeys, and this is all so this is getting really quite down into the deep methodology of landscape assessment. But that's you can perceive a place, or you have ways of perceiving landscapes that aren't necessarily dependent on the place that you are in. You tend to bring that with you. Experiential aspects are about being present in the landscape. So the simple way to think of it is the experiential is an aspect, albeit a pretty significant aspect of the broader concept of perception.
So an example of that would be if I was a manufacturer of concentrated plants, and I would go for a walk along that track and go, oh, there's a nice one over there. I perceive that completely differently. But if I was just, I suppose, didn't have any of that background and I was just there experiencing it, would be different.
We had, just as a very quick way of illustrating, when we were doing the salvage for the arena, which is completely different, but we got into a really interesting conversation around the broader community of Tauranga, Moana, and their perceptions of the wreck, which was different to the experience of the people that actually went to the wreck. Right, so it's kind of, there's a distinction there between actually being in a place and experiencing it experiential, than the broader concepts of perception. Now, it's pretty great. You know,
but it's an important inquiry. But the worrying feature is human adaptability to change. As a species, we're extraordinarily adaptable, so that what's perceived to be incongruous over time becomes, you get desensitized to it, or you. So, but the point I was going to follow through with is this environment perceptually seen as a rural environment? The site?
no, because I don't think the site is perceived on its own. But this setting, and I talk about it in my evidence around this juxtaposition, right?
Yeah.
And perception particularly, but landscape generally, doesn't really respect cadastral lines. So a lot of the perception of this environment is borrowing from the parts that aren't rural. Undoubtedly, there are aspects that are of the rural site that people, openness is probably the best example.
Yeah.
But the scenic values aren't just based on openness. It's the fact that openness affords views to highly natural, highly valued, long distance views and aspects like that.
Right. The long distance views to what?
To the Southern Alps, or at least to the Mahinapua backdrop.
So in that sense, any type of factory located on a main highway in any location in the district is likely to have a highly significant perceptual effect.
Potentially, because of the nature of the development. If you think about, if when you drive over, I've got in-laws on the coast over in the Grey District, not down here, so really cute. But when we drive there regularly, right? The kinds of rural development that you see proximate to roads are things like rotary milking stations and houses and feedlots. My sister-in-law's got a farm, 100-hectare farm out at Ruatapu, which is on the way to Lake Front. And 100 metres off the road, there's a covered feedlot. It's 100 metres long. It's 5 metres high. Next to a rotary dairy shed, next to a house. So you see these sorts of things, and those are what I would call typical in the rural landscape. 17-metre high industrial-looking processing plant is not typical, and so it does have likely a high degree of perceptual effect.
Yeah. All right, that's very clear. Thank you, Mr. Rob. So thank you very much for being around all day for this. Probably found it interesting and helpful anyway.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yep, I've seen that it was a very educational afternoon. So thank you for hanging on for a little bit longer.
That's all right. So thank you very much for your contribution. And we'll consider that all very seriously. That's probably enough for today. Does anyone have any housekeeping issues about managing tomorrow? I would like to start at 9:30 tomorrow for particular reasons. Does anyone have a problem with that?
Hopefully we'll finish before 3 o'clock or so.
Yeah, we should. Well, we may not finish, depends how much the reply is, but I think we can get through.
I'm traveling on Wednesday, just putting that out there.
Yeah, I think we'll be done by tomorrow. All right, so thank you very much, and we'll look forward to hearing the planning view of all of that and moving through that phase. Thank you.